This is Scrutiny, written by W.J. May, narrated by Zach Smith. Prologue. And the fox and the hen ran into their den at the sound that the fiddlers played. But never did they see such love as Carnassus did that day. And the sun shone bright well into the night when the monsters came to play. But never did they see such blood as Carnassus did that day. Chapter 1. In times of stress, most people tended to freeze. It was that lesser-known option, the silent cousin wedged between fight and flight. There was no controlling it. Once a certain threshold had been reached, the body simply locked down. A surge of adrenaline quickened the heart rate. The muscles locked into place. The stomach abruptly vanished, leaving behind a sense of being hollow, while pinpricks of dread rippled along the scalp. There wasn't a single person in the meadow who didn't freeze that fateful morning, staring toward the forest with the same breathless emotion reflecting in their eyes. The monsters froze as well. Where they'd come from, no one could guess. They seemed to have dragged themselves straight from the depths of hell. In hindsight, there weren't that many, no more than a dozen. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up in sheer, unadulterated size. The ones in the front resembled some kind of bloated jungle cat, but there was a thickness to them, and none of the inherent grace. Where there were meant to be eyes, tiny black orbs darted across the meadow like those of a snake. Where there was meant to be fur, chunks of ragged, greyish spikes patterned across their bodies instead. The ones standing behind were much bigger. In a moment of mindless betrayal, Kiera realized that all the gossip she'd heard in the tavern and all the stories she'd heard as a child had gotten it wrong. There were not simply ogres and trolls and giants, but a wide stretch of harrowing creatures that loomed in between. These creatures were as tall as the Glycerin, their sinewy bodies brimming with just as much brutish strength. A few were simply nameless terrors, demons in a state of living decay, while others bore an odd resemblance to animals, though each stood upon two legs like a man. Kiera didn't know which was the most terrifying. Her eyes roved ceaselessly between them, unable to decide which was worse. For a split second, they drifted to all the people as well. "They will not survive this. None of us will survive it." Then, a little girl pointed to one of the creatures in front. "Look, Mama, a kitty!" For a suspended moment, there wasn't a single person in the meadow who didn't follow her gaze. Even the death cat she'd been pointing to cast a quick glance around, as if confused that such a description could ever be levelled against something that resembled itself. Then the freeze lifted, and that sunlit meadow was ripped apart. "Run!" A single shout echoed from the crowd, but it was quickly overtaken in a clamour of barbaric snarls and demonic shrieks. Like a shadowy tide, they swept across the grass at a speed that defied even Kiera's stricken expectations, trembling the ground beneath them as they crashed into the happy festival with enough force to tear skin from bone. Tables overturned, and tents vanished, ripped from the ground like oversized flowers, then shaken violently to spill out any people lingering inside. A swarm of skeletal birds flew out of the forest behind them, each strong enough to lift people straight into the sky, and there was a wild cry from the merchants' wagons as one of those hulking beasts turned out to breathe fire. Kiera stared in horror, still rooted in place. Carnassus was dead. He hadn't even left his chair. That wide belly of his had been split straight across the middle by a demonic talon, staining the table in front of him with a sickening mixture of ale and blood. There were many more like him, people who had been struck down before they even had time to rise to their feet. But life had not been easy for anyone who had gathered at the festival, and even more of them were starting to rally. A sudden hand yanked her onto her feet. "You need to run!" Jessie shouted directly at her, though they were only standing a few inches away. "Do you hear me, Kiera? You need to take out your blade and—" He cut off suddenly, as a monstrous bird swooped down from above and fastened onto the back of his cloak, curling those wicked talons and lifting him into the sky. "Jess!" She reached desperately after him, but those birds were fast as lightning, and it was already too late. In a matter of seconds, he was nothing but a shadow, lifting higher off the ground. That being said, the shifter had no intention of letting himself be carried away. If it had grabbed any other person, it might have been successful. Its brethren were certainly having great success further along the field, but Jesse wasn't like most people. And he'd been holding a blade of his own when it grabbed him. In a single reflexive movement, he swung violently upward, separating the rest of its body from its scaled feet. It veered away with a wraith-like screech as he landed back upon the grass, taking a moment to right himself before grabbing her once more. "Did you hear me?" he shouted again, as if they had scarcely been interrupted. "You need to take out your blade and run!" Eden was already sprinting across the grass, not toward the monsters like she might have imagined, but toward the abandoned arena at the other end of the field. "The archery ring," she realized. "He's going for the bows and arrows." It almost seemed a laughable sentiment, given what they were up against, but he wasn't the only one fighting back. It was a fervor that had swept across the meadow just as quickly as any dark tide, and as she quickly discovered, those gentle festival people were not as gentle as they seemed. "All together!" She whirled around as some of the barrel-chested men who'd been tossing boulders just a few minutes before loaded a few onto the broken axle of a wagon, then catapulted them full force into the ribs of an approaching monster. The creature let out a hideous roar, stamping its feet like an enraged bull. Then, in a moment that defied all reason and understanding, it tried to dig the stones out of its body, using nothing but a pair of its own razor-sharp claws. There was another howl, followed by a shower of blood. As it fell to one knee, quickly overwhelmed by a pack of shifters that appeared from nowhere and ripped it to shreds. Jesse tensed at the ready, aching to shift himself, but Kiera was gaping in astonishment. "How did it just... Does it not feel pain?" Another beast picked up on the excitement, trampling closer to finish the dying creature itself, only to be instantly overrun by those same wolves. What began as a small group had expanded into something more, as every pack who'd come to the festival had merged together into a single force, one that was strong enough to annihilate virtually anything in its path. For everything else, there was magic. Kiera's eyes blossomed with light as a coven of witches used a collective spell to entrap one of the giant cats racing toward it. While it wasn't enough to destroy the creature, it slowed it down enough that a hefty dwarf made short work of it with an axe. One of those delicate nymphs she'd been marveling at earlier had put what looked to be an ogre into a kind of trance, giving a group of elderly people the time they needed to run back to the wagons and escape. The spell lasted only as long as it was needed. When the ogre whirled around in a rage, she turned promptly into a flowering willow. The tree was smashed to bits. There was no saving it. But a single warlock levitated one of the splintered branches and drove it straight into the ogre's mouth. It choked once, then died badly. The warlock stared a split second, then limped away. "I don't believe it. They're actually turning the tide." None of the different factions would have stood a chance on their own. If they'd chosen to scatter, they would have been chased down in the forest or picked off by those circling birds. But when all of them stood together, that was something else entirely. And the wolves. Never had Kiera seen anything like the wolves. Perhaps it was simply the fact that they were so sudden. Human one moment and beast the next. There was no time for delicacy or the removal of clothing. The little fairground was strewn with the remains of tunics and strips of leather boots. But more likely, it was the sheer ferocity. Never could Kiera have pictured herself indulging in such savagery. Nowhere in her entire body was a hint of that primal urge. Before her very eyes, a group of what had recently been men leapt upon the back of one of those terrifying beasts and started ripping into it with their mouths. Jesse was quick to join them, adding his boots and tunic to the rest. "Run!" His parting words echoed in her ears. If it weren't for the fact that many of the beasts had been subdued already, he likely would never have left her alone. But there were other people in more desperate need of protection. The festival was a place for families, and there were still plenty roving nightmares to go around. "Papa!" She took 3 steps towards the forest, then whirled around as a pair of shadows streaked past. It took a second to realize they were the same feline monstrosities she'd seen earlier. It took another second after that to realize that she was not the intended target. Those yellow eyes had fixed upon a boy in his late teens, one who was screaming in desperation for his father. Not to come save him, but to run the other way. "Papa, no!" he cried, lifting a blunted sword as the deadly cats raced closer. His father was barreling toward him at the same time. "I can handle it! I can handle—" There was a muted thud as the young man was tackled out of the way by an older version of himself. Soon after came a series of sickening noises Kiera would remember as long as she lived. The boy fell to the ground, stunned. Then he sprang back up with a scream. "Stay back!" she cried frantically, grabbing hold of his shirt. "It's already over. I'm sorry, you cannot save him." He gave her a fierce shove, knocking her backward onto the grass, then raced forward once again, waving that sword with a terrible scream. She scrambled to her feet, ready to either help or restrain, before realizing all at once that something very important was missing from the picture. "Where's the other cat?" For a split second, everything was quiet. Then she heard the first of the screams. When the monsters had first rushed out of the forest, the older generation had pushed the children back, instructing them to run toward the forest. Some of them had obeyed. Some of them had made it only as far as the abandoned wagons before panicking and ducking underneath. Kiera spotted them just a second after the creature, watching in silent horror as it stalked slowly forward, with its chin lowered to the ground. There was no time to think about the next steps. There was no time to shout for someone better or make a plan. Without a second's hesitation, she sprinted straight toward them, throwing her body into the beast's path. Now what? There was no way to fight it. She had lost her only blade. There was no way to divert it. The creature had already selected its prey. She could try to catch it by surprise, but it was already stalking slowly forward, snickering under its breath. At the same time, she was hyper-aware of the children, crouching beneath the wagon, staring in silent terror through the spokes of the wheels. I should have gotten that mace after all. When it jumps at me, you're going to run, she instructed softly, without ever taking her eyes from the beast. You're going to run into the forest, all right? Just as fast as you possibly can. There was a whimper of assent, as a few scanned the open field behind them. Most of the others had silently resolved to never leave the wagon. The danger was apparent, but their bodies could not be coaxed into such a vulnerable expanse. Better to hide, even at the risk of those fangs. Those terrible fangs were something weighing heavy on Kiera's mind as well. She stared at them without thinking, easing slowly forward, keeping herself directly between the cat and the cart. Come on, you brute. Keep your eyes on me. She lifted her arms ever so slightly. For what? She would never know. There was no skill she could level against such a creature that would make a bit of difference. At this point, they were most likely just to shield her face. It was a terrible reminder she had never quite felt so acutely. It's why I should have worked harder with my lessons, she swallowed. Already speaking the past tense. Not a great sign. On my count, do you hear me? She called out softly, knowing the second it was anything more sudden, the creature would lunge. 1, 2, 3. There was a blur of movement, as several things happened at once. The beast sprang into the air, and most of the children did run after all, scrambling out from beneath the wagon and heading toward the forest in a chorus of screams. Kiera threw up her arms, vowing to get in at least a few good punches, only to watch in what felt like slow motion as that gaping jaw opened and those yellow eyes fixed in dilated concentration on her neck. There would be no time for punches. The creature was much faster than she. In the end, she could only brace for the impact, one leg angled back into the grass behind her. Only a second before it could touch her, a giant wolf leapt in between. Jessie! Her heart caught in her chest as she watched the two collide with terrifying force, spiraling in dizzied angles across the grass. Even amidst so many others, there wasn't a doubt in her mind that it was him. Not because he jumped in front of her, but because the look in his eyes when he did. 7 hells! He was no match for the beast in size, but it didn't seem to matter. There was a fire inside him, and a brighter kind of magic that paired equal with all the rest. Perhaps it even rose a bit higher, because no sooner had the beast found its balance than he pivoted in a hairpin turn and knocked it right back off its feet. At that point, things became almost difficult to watch. For aesthetic reasons, if nothing else. The creature had never presented as fully intact, not since the moment it had stepped into the clearing. There were odd gaps in the matted spines that covered it, areas that looked as if they had been so repeatedly scarred that the skin beneath may no longer have been technically living. Jessie did not improve upon that image. With a blistering roar, he threw himself right on top of it, artfully dodging the claws that were levelled back at him and digging as though he was building castles at the beach. Each swipe tore away wide strips of that mottled carcass, sending them flying into the air behind him as he shifted his weight forward and began ripping away whatever might be left. The creature did not go down willingly. That much was certain. It had taken a full pack to subdue most of its brethren, and even then they had lost friends in the process. Jessie was a single man, a single wolf, but Kiera didn't think the notion had ever crossed his mind. There was another horrifying impact as the creature dislodged him and staggered back to its feet. The two regarded each other for a moment, one leaking greyish blood as the other literally pawed the ground in anticipation, before they crashed into each other once more. Kiera scrambled out of range as they somersaulted past, backing ironically toward the same wagon under which the children had been hiding. But no sooner did her hands touch upon the rough wood than the fight was over. The wolf had most decidedly won. With a final cry, he ducked between those deadly claws and sank his teeth into the creature's throat, ending its gurgling snarls with a single, decisive movement. The beast went suddenly quiet. He stared down a few seconds to be sure, then backed away, looking around for a beautiful girl. He found her near the wagon, looking like she was going to be sick. Is it over? In a shimmer of air, he actually shifted back, forgetting the danger around them, needing the human reassurance of holding her in his arms. What the hell were you thinking? He demanded, clasping her against him. Were you just going to stand there? I distinctly remember telling you to run. She trembled in silence, pressed against his bare skin. His heart was pounding, but it wasn't anywhere near as fast as hers. Despite the fact that the immediate danger had passed, she found herself still caught in the middle, like she'd reached some new height of terror and was unable to come down. After a few quaking seconds, she took a breath. I lost it, she finally stammered. He glanced at the top of her head, wondering if she'd been damaged after all. What? My blade. Her eyes flashed around the grass, as if she might find it.
"I wasn't just going to stand there, but there were these children, Jesse, and I couldn't find my blade."
It was a good thing he was holding her. From such an angle, she wasn't able to see the exact look that swept across his face. That being said, he made his opinion rather clear. With a venomous glare to match anything he'd flung at the monster, he stormed toward the nearest body and ripped a blade from its hand. A cursory wipe, and he thrust it into hers. "Do not lose this." She nodded silently and wrapped her fingers around the handle.
"I won't."
From that point on, the two of them stayed close together, facing every new danger as a unit, and attacking every new monster as a team. He made her feel braver. She hadn't counted on that. And not just in the confidence that he would always protect her. This went further than that, drawing out something deep inside her, making her brave in her capacity for action, not just fear. When a flock of those skeletal birds attacked a group of teenage warlocks, she threw herself right in the middle, hacking them to pieces with her blade. When a demonic jackal leapt upon the back of a witch, she flung herself upon it, stabbing and slashing and screaming with all her might. Perhaps she had some of that savagery after all. Perhaps it was simply a primal need to protect. Whatever the reason, she wasn't the only one stirred with the feeling. The entire festival had come together at the same time, uniting against a common enemy, determined to drive it back.
"Not that there's much to be fighting."
A sudden noise caught her attention.
"At least, not over here."
When she'd first looked around the clearing, she'd believed that most of the creatures had been vanquished. Few were still moving. Various pieces of their bodies had been littered across the trampled grass. But she saw now that while some of them had been killed, most had been merely diverted. And at that point, she really shouldn't have been surprised where they'd been diverted to.
The man loves playing the odds.
Eden was standing like a pillar in the middle of the field, a lone point of attention for every roving monster and unearthly demon still prowling about the grass. His arms were lifted, and those bright eyes never stopped moving as he fired a hailstorm of arrows into the air. In a dark twist of irony, he'd actually perched atop one of the archery targets, presenting the world's most obvious bullseye to each of the nightmares that approached. A rather chilling image for anyone watching. Knowing the Fae, it was probably intentional.
By the stars.
There was something utterly surreal about watching him. Something that made the bloodied and battered festival-goers stare in perfect silence, instead of indulging the instinct to flee. It was as though they'd been fighting a battle in the real world, and he was showing them how it might look in a song or on paper. Every breath was painted in emotion. Every silver arrow flew fast and true. Jesse made a compulsive movement towards him, then eased back to Kiera's side. There was no point in trying to help him. The Fae had no need for assistance, and those monsters had made an impenetrable crescent in between. Nevertheless, he was making short work of them. No matter how fast they ran toward him, no matter how loud their growls echoed in the sky, they fell to the ground like spent leaves at his feet, rolling forward in momentum before sliding to a final stop. A few of the birds tried swooping from above, but when he made a game of trying to hit more than two with a single arrow, they shifted direction without provocation and took off into the sky. The rest of them would probably have wished to retreat as well, but such instincts didn't come naturally to a monster, and they continued pouring forward instead, dropping to the ground one after another, until after a few deafening minutes, just a single creature was left. This one was bigger than all the others. It was the reason it had survived for so long. It took a single look at its fallen comrades, then it lifted its eyes to the Fae standing across the grass. A peculiar expression drifted across its face, a kind of abstract caution it had never once felt in the hundreds of years it had been alive. Then, without any warning, it turned on its heel and ran. "Come on!" he shouted behind it, picking up a fallen tent pole and twirling it like a javelin in his hands. "Come on and finish it!" Oddly enough, when people spoke of the festival later, that was one of the things they remembered the most. Not the initial fear or the chaos that followed, not the frantic screams or the flashes of metal or the way the air was scented with hazelnut brandy and blood. They remembered the moment when the deranged Fae lifted his bow and laid waste to the creatures of darkness. They remembered when he picked up a spear and shouted a challenge to the gods. And so a new legend is born. Most people imagined him to be some kind of a god himself. Others believed him to be mentally unstable. But it was worse than any of them could have possibly known. Because when the dust settled, and the others began the slow process of taking stock, finding their loved ones, staunching the bleeding and burying the dead, Eden lifted his eyes to the creature, retreating into the trees. They lingered a split second before lightening with a spark of adventure. When he spotted his friends, that spark grew into a blinding smile. "Come on!" he called with excitement. "It's getting away!" Chapter 2. "Eden, wait!" The Fae strode purposely toward the forest, while his friends hurried after him. One was struggling to clothe himself in the process. The other was stumbling along in a daze. The fighting might have stopped, but Kiera's ears were still ringing with those ghostly howls and those wailing screams. She couldn't take a single step without crushing the pieces of something that was left behind. A splintered talon stamped into the grass, the tattered remains of a shoe. What will happen to it all? Will it simply be worn by the wind and the rain until there is nothing left? Jesse's attention was a bit more directed. "Eden!" he called again, circling in front of the Fae and forcing a stop. "Can you stop being yourself for a single moment and look around you?" He threw open his arms, gesturing to the chaos enveloping the field. "We cannot leave. We have to deal with this. We need to stay." Eden allowed him to finish speaking, but he never turned from the woods. "Are either of you hurt?" he asked instead, looking from one to the other. "Do either one of you want to let that creature massacre some other group of unsuspecting people? Or perhaps you'd like to wait until it gathers its senses and comes back for the ones right here?" He waited for a response, but there was nothing but silence. "Good, then we are in agreement." The others had time for a single moment of shared exasperation before racing to catch up with him once again. No, they were not in agreement, and given some of the visuals still rattling around in Kiera's head, she would like nothing more than to run screaming the other way. It was pure madness to go after one of the creatures on their own, let alone that particular beast. But in his entire life, Eden had never been accused of being sane. "I'm hoping you have at least some kind of plan," Jesse asked begrudgingly. The Fae warmed with a secret smile before glancing back in mock alarm. "What are you still doing with hands?" he exclaimed disapprovingly, cuffing the wolf for good measure. "Shift back immediately. It is your only asset, Jesse." He twirled the broken tent pole, lifting it to his shoulder like a spear. "And yes, I have a plan." 7 hells. The shifter glared, but did as he asked, casting Kiera a look of helpless frustration before transforming from man to wolf. She needed no help being angry, but she also wasn't the faintest bit surprised. As long as there was breath in his body, the Fae would feel called upon to do such things. And if such things happened to involve slaying monsters, all the better. "What about me?" she asked with a scowl, falling into pace at his side. "Must I take part in your little suicide as well, or may I simply hire mourners and pretend to grieve?" The wolf snickered beside him, as Eden cast her an indulgent grin. You, my dear, are indispensable. We shall be requiring your assets as well." She maintained that fixed scowl, but the closer they got to that shadowy forest, the more she was having trouble remembering what any of those assets might happen to be.
"Oh, yes?" she asked stiffly. "And what are those?"
The Fae regarded her for only an instant, before clapping her kindly on the back. "You have a lovely smile." She froze mid-step, glaring openly at the back of his head. The wolf hesitated a moment, torn between them, then shrugged his shoulders and gestured her forward with a weary sigh.
"If that monster doesn't manage to kill you, I'm going to do it myself."
Considering they had taken off right after the beast, it still managed to travel a remarkable length of ground, each of its long strides constituting about almost 30 of what it would take a normal man. That being said, it was in no way difficult to track. One had merely to follow the wreckage that trailed in its wake. Spindly birch and towering redwoods, the creature smashed them all alike, leaving behind a wide stretch of trampled forest the friends were able to walk upon as easily as any road. "If only we could direct it north," Eden whispered conspiratorially. His smile faded at the pair of looks he received in return. "Just trying to lighten the tension." They quickened their pace and made it all the way back to the slice of the forest where they'd made camp the night before. In a land of peaks and ravines, it was relatively flat, with nothing but towering evergreens and clusters of moss-covered boulders to break up the repetition. Scores of lesser predators were openly retreating from the woods ahead of them, without any compunction of being followed or seen. A pair of foxes darted through the underbrush, fleeing in the opposite direction, and a frightened coyote actually knocked between their legs in its hurry to escape. The friends paused a moment, staring after it with a look of belated surprise.
"That bodes well."
Kiera's eyes lingered on that whip of a tail, quick to vanish into the ferns. She felt herself moved with a sudden urge to follow, but if anything, the sight only spurred the Fae on faster. He no longer paused to make sure they were keeping pace with him, but quickened that impossible speed. The light caught upon the pole resting on his shoulder, and his cloak trailed in the wind behind him, those light-footed steps leaving not a single print on the forest floor. The others were having a slightly harder time. While the wolf padded noiselessly across the terrain with almost as much ease as the Fae, the teenage barmaid was not equipped for such things. Twice, her clothes got snagged in brambles, and Jessie had to double back to extract her. Twice, her ankle rolled, and she let out a gasp of pain.
"Do not be the thing that slows them down. Do not be the thing that stops this from happening."
She picked herself up yet again, looking down at the scrapes across her palms, until a velvet soft nose appeared before her, sniffing her near the temple, before bobbing up her chin. Her eyes lifted with the most unlikely of smiles.
"He will run us to death," she said cheerfully. "The beast will never get its chance."
It was hard to decipher the expressions of a wolf, but she could have sworn that Jessie was smiling. At any rate, he lifted her back onto her feet, hesitating for a long moment before sinking halfway down in the strangest of gestures. Kiera stared without understanding, a hand still resting absent-mindedly on his fur. His front knees were bent, while his back legs stayed standing. There was a slight arch to his shoulders in a way that created a little hollow. A place for a person to sit. Her eyes widened in surprise.
"Are you sure?" she whispered, well aware the Fae was getting away from them. "I've asked for that every day since we left Farian. You never let me. You almost bit off my hand."
He stayed exactly as he was, glancing over his shoulder.
"If you insist."
With a look of scarcely contained wonder, she knitted her fingers into that chestnut fur and eased herself onto his back. Slowly at first, then with the sudden giddiness of a child. There was a height to it that she hadn't expected,
a sense of being too high off the ground that made her sway precariously before seizing onto him once again for balance. "Sorry," she breathed in immediate apology. "I don't want to hurt you." This time, the smile was unmistakable. His lips twitched, as if such a thing could not be of less concern, before he took a sudden jarring step forward. She lurched over his shoulders, and he paused with a pointed look. "Hold on tight." She nodded swiftly, lacing her fingers into his glossy coat as tight as she dared. There was a moment of stillness as he waited, before taking off into the forest once more. From that first bounding leap, she knew she'd never be satisfied walking at a human pace ever again. Her hair flew up in a cloud as the world raced past at a speed she had never imagined, with a grace that one could not fully understand without having experienced such a thing themselves. If we weren't racing toward a monster, it might be truly thrilling. Even knowing what awaited them, even bloodied from the place where they'd come, an involuntary gasp of delight burst from her lips, and the wolf spurred himself even faster, stretching out those long legs, making her heart fly as they closed the distance between themselves and the Fae. Eden threw a quick glance over his shoulder as they approached, but said not a word in acknowledgement. They were getting close. Each of them could feel it. Save for the wind in their ears, the woods around them had gone tense and quiet, like a quivering dam about to break free. That was when they finally spotted it, moving swiftly toward the distant sun. It noticed them at the same time. There was no delay between thought and action, no fleeting pause of recognition or even surprise. Perhaps it was because the beast didn't possess a great capacity for higher thought. Perhaps it was because retreat wasn't in its vocabulary, and it was already considering turning back around. Perhaps it recognized the Fae. Before Kiera could draw in a breath, it caught hold of the nearest redwood and yanked it up by the roots, bellowing like a raging child, before hurling it straight at Eden. 7 hells! Even with his lightning-fast reflexes, the Fae barely managed to leap out of the way in time. It crashed into the forest behind him, collapsing a dozen evergreens beneath its mighty weight. The 3 friends stared in silence before turning slowly back to the beast. "I think it remembers you," Jesse panted. Eden's lips curved with the hint of a smile. "I think you're right." No sooner had he spoken than the beast thundered toward them with a mighty scream, sending scores of frightened birds exploding from the trees. It was shaped like a man, but only insofar that it had legs to run. The rest of it better resembled some kind of giant bear, with roughly hewn limbs, 2 horns poking from its forehead, and curved fangs the size of their tent. The ground trembled, making each of them take a step backward. "Those teeth are longer than my hand," Kiera whispered, unable to fathom why they were holding their ground. "You told me never to challenge something with teeth longer than my hand." The wolf bristled beneath her, but Eden was calm and steady, taking a knife from his belt and cutting a notch into the tip of the pole, turning it into some kind of javelin. He twirled it with just as much skill, eyes dancing with anticipation, as the creature got closer and closer. "Normally, you would be right, but this happens to be an exception." She whipped around to see him, hoping to read the answers on his face, to find some clue as to a plan for their survival, but she received no such help, because she had no such luck. The Fae was no longer there. "Eden?" she actually called aloud, eyes scanning frantically through the forest, only to catch a parting glimpse as he sprinted up into the trees. Up into the trees. There was no pause in acceleration. There was no attempt to climb. He ran toward the trees, then simply kept running, as though the law that kept the rest of them grounded was just a guideline, as if he'd broken bigger rules before. The monster kept charging, unaware that 3 targets had whittled down to 2. There was a chance it might never have figured it out, but the Fae had a particular way of announcing himself. "Oh my!" Kiera sucked in a breath, peering through her fingers, as there was a sudden parting in the sunlit canopy, and, like a god of heaven, the Fae came spiraling down. There was a mighty cry as he drove the spear deep into the hollow of the beast's shoulder. Then, with even greater strength, he managed to wrench it free. There was a great spattering of blood, echoed by another of those bear-like bellows, but none of it managed to touch the Fae. He vanished again, quick and unsullied. Of course he allowed us to linger. He never intended to let the beast get close. Again and again, he dove with that sun-tipped spear, drawing blood with each agonizing thrust, driving the beast to madness. It seemed only a matter of time before that eternal luck of his ran out, but perhaps Eden sensed this, because when it finished, it seemed to be on his own terms. There had been no pattern to the attacks, nothing predictable by which the creature might be able to attack him. But when the Fae came down at the same angle as before, the beast reared up on its legs and grabbed hold of the spear, yanking him straight out of the sky. Kiera screamed, and the wolf let out a breathless howl. But the Fae was perfectly silent as he fell like a pierced bird from the heavens, his arms drifting up beside him, those bright eyes locking upon the writhing monster beneath him, searching for the best place to land. True to form, he alighted upon its jaw, only a breath away from those gnashing teeth. "I cannot watch this," Kiera gasped, turning her face away. The beast tossed its head and snapped its fangs, missing the Fae by inches. "I cannot stand to see." It wasn't how she wished to remember him, shredded like a doll in the mouth of a monster, every hint of that sparkling laughter fading from his eyes. She wanted to remember only the happy parts, those hopeful bits that felt worth saving. She didn't want to be in the forest at all. But Eden had no intention of dying, and the Fates had no intention of letting her see. There was another deafening yowl, like the braying of a mule. Then the creature saw past the infuriating Fae to his tiny companions, still watching from the ground, unable to catch those swift immortal feet. It shifted targets instead, uprooting another tree and hurling it towards them. If Kiera hadn't been on Jessie's back, she would have been killed in an instant. As it stood, they just barely got away. The wolf leapt skyward, just as the tree crashed beneath them, collapsing a nearby crop of boulders, which promptly tumbled down upon their heads. "Look out!" Her cries for help were lost in the clamour and muffled by dust. She inhaled a great mouthful, choking for air, as the rocks settled around them and the deafening cacophony went suddenly still. It must only have been seconds, but it seemed to take ages for her vision to clear. In a blind panic, she felt her arms and legs before groping around the stone, searching desperately for a touch of fur. She found a hand instead. "Jess?" He coughed, lifting to his feet.
"Who else would it be?"
The two came together in a clumsy embrace, both struggling to find their balance, ears ringing with the sound of stone colliding with stone. It should have killed them. There was no question as to that. But ironically enough, that fallen tree turned out to be their salvation. It had struck the ground first, carving out a hollow, before the rocks sealed them in from above. Without the deep grooves made from its branches, they would have been crushed into dust. There was a pause in the distant clearing as the beast surveyed its work with satisfaction, and the Fae abandoned the fight completely, dropping his spear and racing toward his friends.
"Are you all right?"
They heard him calling from afar, then again much closer. There was a rustling on the other side of the stones, and two bright eyes shone through a crack.
"Someone answer me. Are you all right?"
There was another cough, followed by a curse.
"We're all right, aren't we?"
Jessie looked Kiera up and down, patting the sides of her clothes, before pressing a swift kiss to her face.
"We're all right, but I can't move this." Unseen by the others,
The Fae rested his head against the stone, sending up a silent prayer of thanks, while Jesse tried again to shift the stone, throwing his entire body against it. "Eden!" he called again. "I can't move it!" The Fae lifted a hand to the boulders, then the beast let out a roar behind him. He threw a quick glance over his shoulder, then headed back across the clearing, picking up his makeshift spear. "I'll return in a moment. We can leverage it with something. Eden! 1 moment," he repeated, walking slowly towards the beast. "That's all this will take." In hindsight, Kiera didn't think he was the least bit frightened, or even concerned as to his chances. Quite the contrary, it was how he preferred it. The children he'd been tasked with protecting were contained, safe from both themselves and others. He was free to fight the monster on his own. And it was a fight he would relish. No more were there wasted movements or shallow jabs. There was a fire burning in his eyes, unlike anything Kiera had ever seen. Part of it was protective. The beast had attacked his friends, nearly killed them. But another part was entirely different, hailing from a place far from this. Perhaps it came from the place of which his people were always speaking. Perhaps it came from the stars. With a shattering scream, he sprinted forward, flying at the beast straight as an arrow, before continuing upward, the way he'd done with the trees. His friends watched through that crack in the stone as the creature froze in utter surprise. How could this tiny attacker be so foolish? In what parallel dimension did he imagine that he might actually... A shower of blood rained through the air as the beast let out a terrible cry. The Fae had driven his spear deep into its throat before using the grip to somersault himself still higher, up between the creature's yellowed eyes, landing between its horns. The spear was lost, but the Fae still had his arrows. Better yet, he still had his knives. 2 flashes of silver glinted high in the sun as Eden flipped straight over the creature's brow, slowing his deadly speed only by raking the blades behind him, tearing off 2 staggering pieces of the creature's brutish face. Kiera gripped onto the stone, holding very still. It was the kind of scene that was nearly lost in the moment, though at the same time it would be impossible to ever forget. There was something so enchanting about the sight of him. Even when he was killing, even covered in blood, there was something almost transcendent, as if by the mere act of watching, you too were from this elevated place, as if the mere proximity made one brighter, held close enough to reflect that distant star. How can we be so alike, and yet so different? How are 2 such creatures born under the same sky? That was when Kiera realized she wasn't the only one watching. Her pulse quickened as she turned her gaze from the battle to the distant trees. A pair of dark eyes glittered high above, only visible when they caught the occasional glint of light. She squinted for a better look, grabbing Jesse in alarm. "Is that a vampire?" The shifter's eyes shot up before he renewed his efforts with the stone. Time after time, he threw his body against it, but no matter how much force he used, it wouldn't budge another inch.
"Yes, it is."
In a mindless kind of panic, Kiera pressed her eyes to the crack, staring through the thin shaft of light as a catastrophe in process, one that only a single person was able to see. There was no way to warn Eden. The Fae was in a different world. The anger had broken into occasional bursts of light. His friends were alive. The monster was crumbling. The Fae was born for such things. Those endless horizons danced in his eyes. When his spear flashed in the sun, it was followed by a burst of laughter. Light, sparkling laughter that seemed to hang on the air, warming the shadows and sweetening the breeze. The beast was still thundering in a feral rage, but the beast was no longer a part of the story. The Fae was writing his own ending, and there wasn't room enough on the stage for 2. "Look behind you!" Kiera pulled in a silent breath, pressed tight against the stone. The vampire was watching in astonishment, his eyes shining with a touch of the same wonder that seemed to mark the Fae's every step. There was plenty of blood, but he was restraining himself. There were plenty of moments of opportunity, but he was ignoring those too. Then Eden struck a death blow, and it became too much. The vampire came out of nowhere, just a streak of shadow flying through the air, like a dark comet. He struck the Fae just as the beast was falling, throwing him with terrifying force back to the ground. The forest shook as he landed, sliding backward into a cropping of rocks. There was a sharp crack. Those bright eyes grew heavy enough to shut. "Wake up!" Kiera covered her mouth as the vampire drifted closer, tilting his head with almost childlike curiosity as it walked out of the trees. She remembered a man in the tavern once who had seen one. He was shell-shocked and trembling, but the memory was clear. They were like cats, he had said. Big, intemperate cats. She understood now what he meant. The vampire didn't walk so much as glide, drifting forward with a surreal, dreamlike quality that made her feel lightheaded, almost drunk. She understood for the first time what people meant when they called them intoxicating. She might have been watching him for minutes or hours. There was no way to be sure. She had lost all concept of time. But the vampire had eyes only for the Fae. The contrast between the two men could not have been any greater, yet, in a strange way, they were so very much the same. Both of them a little out of step with the mortal world around them. Both of them sprinkled with that same magic dust, making them a little more. She cried out uselessly as he stepped closer. Jesse threw himself against the stone. "Run!" It took Eden a second to focus, though it made little difference. His senses had shattered upon impact, and even once he'd registered the creature that attacked him, there was little he could do but lay there and wait. As if to invite further peril, blood was pouring freely from his chest as the vampire knelt slowly beside him, trickling down his tunic and soaking into the leaves. The vampire's eyes dilated as he watched its progress. A kind of trance came over him, and every muscle in his body went simultaneously still. It was the same kind of suspension that gripped every such predator. Time enough for a single breath before the inevitable strike. But he paused at the last second, glancing unexpectedly at the Fae. It was difficult to say exactly what happened next. Their eyes locked for what felt like an endless moment, and something passed between them, something that caught both men off guard. Then, without a hint of warning, the vampire sank its fangs into the Fae's neck. "No!" Kiera screamed. The Fae cried out only once, then went unexpectedly quiet, panting softly as he thrashed back and forth, trying to free himself. His legs scrambled on the leaves, his hands pulled with all their might, knotting in the creature's black hair. But there was nothing to be done. In a bizarre sort of embrace, the vampire leaned closer, drinking deeply, drinking slowly, drinking his fill. After a few seconds, Eden's body relaxed in spite of itself, sinking with a chilling finality onto the forest floor. His hands remained tangled in the vampire's onyx locks, but he was no longer trying to stop him. His eyes were strangely unfocused as they stared blankly into the sky. Kiera let out a muffled sob, and even Jesse stopped his frantic attempts long enough to stare with silent dread through the crack in the stone. Even if they managed to free themselves, they were no match against such a creature. That eternal light was fading with every shallow breath. "He is gone already," she realized with a shock. "He is slipping away." A part of her must have been expecting it. A part of her couldn't have been surprised. Even the greatest stories must one day reach their conclusion. Even the mightiest of angels must eventually find a place to land. She just couldn't believe it would happen like this. Then, all at once, the vampire stopped. A kind of stillness fell over the clearing as the creature slowly released him, laying him gently upon the ground. Eden stared up at him in silence, a few seconds away from passing out. Their eyes locked for another suspended moment. Then the vampire was gone.
Chapter 3. It would have been wise to put some distance between themselves and the vampire, but for one of the first times in his life, Eden couldn't. The friends had only been walking about half a mile when he stumbled forward and grabbed Jesse's shoulder, trying to remind himself how to breathe. "I need to rest," he panted. "I need to lie down." The others agreed at once, more shaken than either was fully aware of at the time. It seemed like a miracle that he was even breathing. They would require no further miracles of him today. "Of course," Kiera murmured, watching as Jesse lowered him to the grass without a passing thought as to where they might have paused. "Take all the time you need." Only a few seconds after the vampire disappeared, Jesse had managed to shift the stone. It was another small miracle, but one that was completely forgotten as they squeezed their bodies through the thin opening between the rocks and raced across the clearing to the Fae. He had lost consciousness, but he came around quickly, grabbing Kira's wrist when she pressed a piece of cloth to his neck. Those lovely eyes rested on her face for a split second, unable to drag themselves completely back to the present, before searching wildly through the trees. "Where is he?" he panted, trying to lift his head from the leaves. "Where's the vampire?" She caught him quickly, easing him back down. "He's gone," she answered shakily. "He just left." Jesse seemed to conclude the same thing. He stared around the clearing for a second longer, the Fae's discarded sword gripped tight in his hand, before kneeling to the ground beside them. "Why did he stop?" he asked softly. "I didn't think such a thing was even possible." There was no answer, only the sound of shallow breaths. "Eden?" He waited until the Fae looked at him. "Why did he let you go?" Time stood still as the Fae stared into the forest, his bright eyes roving through the trees. It was a sanctuary for all his people, a natural fount of hope and reassurance, but he found no answers there now. A little shiver swept over him, like someone had whispered in his ear, and, for a fleeting moment, that eternal assurance failed him, and he looked truly lost. He stared a few seconds longer, then shook his head. "I don't know." 2 hours later, the same question remained. Kiera knelt beside him in the middle of the path, a truly terrible place to stop and rest, but neither she nor the shifter gave it a second thought. They had seen what wonders the Fae could do with their own eyes. They could not imagine what it must have taken to break him in such a way. "Maybe we should take you back to the festival," she murmured, changing out the cloth she'd wrapped around his neck. The bites were not large, but they were deep, and the Fae had no blood left to spare. "There will be healers there by now, people who might be able to help." Eden slipped his fingers beneath hers, forcing her hand away. "The only thing I need is to rest," he answered hoarsely, in a voice unlike his own. "I am not injured. The creature cost me blood, and we cannot go back to the valley." Jesse followed every movement, his eyes bright with concern. "Why not?" he asked. "There would be greater safety in numbers." The Fae shook his head, despite the additional pain it caused. "If the creature attacked me once, it may attempt such a thing again. I cannot lead it straight toward a group of people already in recovery. Besides," he added stiffly, "you saw the kinds of beasts that charged out of the forest. For many, many reasons, we must be moving on." Kiera nodded mutely, staring into the trees, but Jesse had been thinking along the same lines since the festival, and despite the Fae's weakened condition, He had no trouble speaking his mind. "Yes, I saw what charged out of the forest," he replied tersely, "and I saw you charge it right back. Alone, Eden. You went after the creature alone." The Fae shot him a quick look, then willed himself to bleed harder. "Can we discuss this later?" "I am near death. You're through the worst of it," Jesse interrupted shortly. "And I believe this is a discussion worth having. You were traveling with armed companions, and yet you still—" "7 hells," Eden murmured, going suddenly pale. The others tensed in unison, glancing over their shoulders.
"What is it?"
Kiera asked anxiously. The Fae pulled in a faltering breath. "My mother, right here, in the flesh." His eyes widened in sheer astonishment, looking not at the forest, but at the shifter himself. "I can't believe it. After all this time." There was a beat of silence. Then Jesse shoved him to the ground. "You're a nightmare," he muttered, pushing to his feet with a reluctant grin. "You just stay here and bleed, all right? I'll try to find us some water. Maybe a coffin, if things take a turn." Kiera laughed in spite of herself, as Eden hitched himself up with a cheerful wave. "He's in a frightful mood. You'd think we didn't just spend the day at the festival." She settled down beside him, fighting the urge to smack him herself.
"He isn't wrong."
She threw him a sideways glance, quoting the Fae's own words. "Some of us tend to overcorrect, live only in the moment. Is any of that sounding familiar?" He paused guiltily, then glanced down at his chest. "Yes, well, I won't be doing that again any time soon." The sun drifted lazily across the sky as the Kiera and Eden moved themselves off the trail and waited for the shifter to return. It was a warm day, the kind that would usually be a blessing, but on that particular afternoon it did nothing but make them sweat and bleed. "So, how did you like travelling by wolf?" Kiera looked up with a start. It had been quiet for so long, she'd half expected that the Fae had fallen asleep, but he was staring with surprising focus, eyes twinkling with a little smile. "You gave us a strange look when you saw it," she replied, avoiding the actual question. "Is it such a strange thing? I haven't any knowledge of wolves or their ways." At first, she thought it must be simply the selfless nature of the offer, but that was no surprise. Jesse was a selfless person, much as he chafed against it. This had to be something more. Eden tilted his head speculatively. "It isn't strange," he finally answered. "It's just not so casual. Not even in cases of dire need. I have seen it occasionally within families, but that is all." Her cheeks flamed, but she lowered her eyes quickly. "Well, you saw that creature," she murmured. "You were practically standing in its mouth. I'd like to think that need was a bit more dire than most. Besides, we are like family." Even as she said the words, she was shocked to realize they were true. The friends might not have been traveling together long, but they had overcome an enormous amount of obstacles in such a short time, braving the kinds of dangers that could forge bonds just as thick as blood. Eden smiled fondly, then shook his head. "That may be true, but I can assure you Jesse would not do such a thing for me. Not under any circumstance." He paused a moment. "But it seems he would do it for you." "Change the subject." There were any number of topics she might have selected, but as fate would have it, a rather obvious solution jumped to mind. "You think they are connected?" she asked suddenly, remembering his reasons for why it was imperative that they leave. "The dragon and what happened at Carnassus." What happened at Carnassus? It was already developing a cheerless ring. The Fae tensed ever so slightly, returning his gaze to the trees. "I think much has been happening that cannot be explained," he murmured, fixing those troubled eyes on the horizon. "It would stand to reason some of it may be connected." She hesitated, almost afraid to ask.
Even the vampire?
No, he said abruptly, lifting a hand to his neck. A vampire is just a vampire. The world is cursed with many like weeds. It was a casual dismissal, but even as he said the words, his eyes scanned again through the sunlit forest, like the creature may well have been watching. Kiera stifled a shiver and scooted closer to him on the grass, remembering the look of wonder in those dark, immortal eyes.
Please let it not be watching. Please let it have gone away.
The little break turned out to last almost 6 hours. Eden drifted off to sleep, awoke, and promptly denied it, then proceeded to spend the rest of their hike pretending that everything was fine. At times that consisted of him scouting ahead on the trail, though his strength had been so depleted he was barely able to level a blade. Other times he recited bawdy jokes and nursery rhymes, anything to distract from the deadly bites on his neck. When Jesse finally lost his temper and offered to make them symmetrical, the Fae flashed an angelic smile and began proffering things they could do instead. Name the various forest creatures, quiz each other vehemently on those names, list everything they saw that happened to be blue. Crochet. Kiera was in stitches. After a few miles went past, even Jesse had to smile. It is no wonder you were able to come with us so easily, he remarked, leaping onto a lower portion of the trail in a wasted effort to create a little space. Your friends and loved ones must have escaped you long ago. My guess is they tried to smother you in your sleep. You didn't like the song? Eden replied innocently. I could think of another. He lifted his eyes to the clouds, searching through his memory, when that immortal balance suddenly faltered and he found himself stumbling to the ground. Eden! Kiera lunged forward, but she wasn't fast enough to catch him. Jesse only barely managed himself, but the Fae wrenched himself free the second his knees touched the grass. Malakos! The others watched in silence as he leveled his gaze at the forest, pressing a fist to the earth for balance, literally shaking in frustration and pain. 6 hours he had rested. 6 hours when it should have been days. Most people would not have survived such an attack in the first place. Most people would have drifted away quickly, their hearts searching desperately for whatever blood remained. It was almost certain the Fae knew this. He had been alive long enough to see such attacks before, but with an almost fearsome defiance, he resisted all attempts to help and clawed himself back to standing, blinking rapidly as the dizzy blur of forest sharpened into separate trees. Jesse stood at a careful distance, ready at a moment to help. I had believed the vampire spared you, he murmured, but perhaps it was more simple in explanation. Perhaps he merely believed you were already spent. Eden's eyes flashed in anger, but he could think of nothing to say in reply. He merely tightened the clasp on his cloak and forced himself to continue walking. The others shared a long look, then fell into step beside him. None of them spoke any further of the vampire. The Fae said nothing more of Crochet. Eden was still quiet when they made camp that night, staring into space and startling slightly when anyone addressed him. Jesse had gone hunting and most likely to do a careful sweep of the perimeter, but Kiera couldn't let the Fae out of her sight. 1,000 images flashed through her head, and she stared with such unnerving intensity it finally broke through his pensive trance. Why are you looking at me like that? He demanded quietly, turning to face her. You are hard to take on the best of days, and I truly have no strength for it now. Her eyes warmed in the firelight, drifting through memories. I'd made myself a promise at Carnassus, she answered. I promised that if the monster didn't kill you, I was going to do it myself. This seems like an opportune moment. The Fae lifted himself onto an elbow. And when did you decide this? Shortly after you complimented my smile. There was a pause. Kiera, I hope you can see how very foolish that sounds. She pushed abruptly to her feet and circled the flames to settle beside him, taking great care to unsheath a blade as she went. When she sat back down, it dangled innocently between them. "You may have deflected Jessie with some jest," she began, "but do you think the same will work on me? Do you think it is only you taking these risks? It is all of us. It is selfish what you did." "Selfish?" he repeated in surprise. "And how is that?" She stared at him evenly. "We were trapped beneath a pile of boulders," she said flatly. "No food, no water, and not a hope of getting out. But you left us anyway. You walked away to fight a monster all by yourself." She tilted her head, holding his eyes. "And what would have happened if you'd failed?" she demanded. "You would die quickly, in the jaws of some beast, while Jessie and I would starve, wondering why you didn't take the extra 10 seconds to help set us free. Thank goodness that vampire didn't kill you. It would have killed us all." It wasn't in his usual repertoire, but the Fae was thoroughly chastened. He bowed his head, unable to think of anything to say in reply. He was just about to break character completely and apologize, when she leaned forward and put a sudden hand upon his knee. "Why didn't he kill you?" Eden froze perfectly still, staring into the fire. For whatever reason, it wasn't like the other times he'd been asked the question, and since they'd left the clearing, he'd been asked it quite a few. It wasn't even like the times he'd asked the question of himself. There was something about the quiet of the woods and the intensity of her stare that framed it differently, that stole his breath and made him consider in a whole new light. "He should have," he answered softly. "I think he was going to." She stared at him, remembering at the same time. "But then you looked at him," she prompted. The Fae shook his head faintly and lifted a hand to his neck with a wince. "I cannot explain it," he murmured. "This whole afternoon I've been running it through my mind, and I still cannot explain it. A vampire cannot keep itself from the blood of an immortal, not until the blood runs dry. It is not possible, and yet he managed to stop himself in time." The words came faster now, like the quiet building of a tide. "I didn't understand," he continued softly. "I remember thinking that I was dreaming, that he had killed me already, if there wasn't so much pain. But then he looked at me." His body went still, lost in memory. "And there was a moment." He trailed into silence, either unable or unwilling to speak any further. She let it hang for a few seconds, giving him time to sort things out, then she leaned forward to catch his eye. "Yes?" It was quiet for a few seconds longer, then he drew in a breath. "There was a moment when I felt as if I'd been waiting for him," he answered softly, "as if our meeting was only a matter of time." His shoulders stiffened, almost like he was afraid she was going to judge him. Then he turned to her with wide, entreating eyes. "Does that make any sense?" She stared back in silence, searching for the words. It wasn't often she was asked for such a weighted opinion. The Fae most always had those answers himself. But there was an uncertainty to him that she had never seen before. Despite the countless years that separated them, the two suddenly felt very much the same age. "It makes as much sense as a vampire saving the life of a Fae." A strange emotion stirred in his eyes, almost like he wished that she'd said something else. It was gone a second later, buried under centuries of deflection and poise. "It matters not. I will never see him again." She nodded quickly, as was expected. Together, the two of them left those turbulent forces for another day and steered the conversation toward safer ground. But no matter how long they talked, or how hard she tried to push past it, those final words echoed like a quiet warning in the back of her mind. I will never see him again. She had a terrible feeling that wasn't entirely true. Chapter 4. It started with a shout and the sound of quick footsteps on the leaves. By the time Eden and Kiera roused themselves and lifted onto their arms, Jesse was already racing back into the camp. "I saw him," he panted, trying to catch his breath. "I saw the same vampire." They were on their feet a second later, sending a wave of dirt hissing over the fire as they reached for their blades and followed him back into the trees. It was the moment each one of them had been waiting for, kept carefully secret, tinged with fear. As their feet pounded the grass, always close together, never daring to stray, Kiera wondered how it was possible that Jesse had even made it back to tell them, how it was possible the creature didn't snuff him out with a flick of its hand. The others stopped instinctively at the edge of the firelight, but Eden ran a few steps further, staring into the trees with such an expression it looked as though he was prepared to raze the entire forest to the ground. Unlike his companions, he'd reached past the swords and grabbed only a thin knife. It glinted in the moonlight as he held it aloft, reflecting in his eyes with an eerie silvery glow. "Where did you see him?" he demanded, searching the shadowy trees. "Just there, beneath the bluff." Jesse pointed without hesitation, but the longer they stood there, seeing nothing more than a gentle curtain of vines, the more that certainty started to fade. "I could have sworn it was him. It was the same dark clothes, the same—" "Do not doubt yourself," Eden interrupted quietly. "Your eyes were not playing tricks. You may trust what you saw." He continued forward alone, pacing toward the exact spot, before sinking to his knees and touching the tips of his fingers to the earth. "He was here. I am sure of it." Kiera's hands tightened around her blade, damp with a nervous sheen. "What should we do?" Although she spoke in a whisper, the words seemed to fly into every open corner, hissing like tiny crests upon the wind. If the vampire was anywhere close, he would surely have heard them. Eden stood up slowly, his eyes making a slow circle through the trees. At one point, they lingered, tightening around the edges, as if they were on the verge of piecing through those shadows and discovering something beyond. But the game had been played, and the forest was empty. When another circle yielded nothing, he paced back to them with a sigh. "We should go back to sleep. There is nothing left in these woods." She took a hesitant step after him, but Jesse stiffened in alarm. "You said you believed me." "I do believe you." "Then why—" "He is gone, Jesse. What would you have me say?" The Fae glanced once more into the darkening forest before heading back to camp. There is nothing more that can be done. It went against every natural instinct, every pressing compulsion to either search or run, but after another moment of reluctance, the shifter was forced to concede the point. There was no way to track a vampire, just as there was no way to throw one off your trail, and even if they somehow managed to find him, what then? They would fight him? 2 teenagers and a wounded Fae. They went back to the camp, like Eden had suggested. They threw more wood onto the fire, dragged their blankets closer together, and lay down their heads. But that was where it ended. Not for a single moment were any one of them able to sleep. They saw the vampire again the next day, and again the day after, and the day after that. It was never any longer than an instant, a hair's breadth splinter of time, gone so fast it left one doubting their own mind. A wisp of dark hair rising above the shadows, a glint of silent eyes watching as they bathed in the river, hidden in the underbrush on the opposite bank. Oddly enough, Kiera and Jesse had grown strangely accustomed to it. Aside from hunting and sleeping in closer proximity, there was very little change on the day-to-day. If the vampire wished to kill them, he could have done so at any moment. The fear was subsiding, lost to the repetition, but Eden was growing more and more agitated, like an animal pacing the bars of its cage. The moments of quiet only made things worse, as if a slow fire was building inside him, just waiting to escape. when they caught sight of the vampire again the following afternoon, watching them gather kindling from the shade of a nearby crest, Eden straightened up slowly, meeting his distant gaze. His body tensed, like a bird about to take flight, but he kept his place by the others. "He's staying longer this time," Kiera murmured beside him, holding the pieces she'd gathered tight to her chest. "And he's close. Could you run him down? Or speak to him? Can they even speak?" Eden let out a quiet sigh. "He is faster than me. I would never catch him." As if the vampire was able to hear them, he turned abruptly on his heel and vanished into the trees. In days past, they would have gone to investigate. Now, they stayed where they were. "What if he comes into camp?" Jessie asked softly, taking care to tread lightly while the Fae's nerves were already stretched so thin. "I suffer no delusions that I could protect us from the likes of a vampire, let alone such a vampire as that. But you? Could you keep him at bay?" Eden hesitated, still staring at the place where he'd vanished. "I believe so." The others shared a quick look behind him. Hardly reassuring. "Come on." Kiera placed a light hand upon the Fae's shoulder, pulling him back from the restless tempers that had consumed him for the better part of a week. "Jessie said there's a trading post across the next ridge. Let's get out of these trees and back to the world for a bit." Eden nodded faintly, not really listening. "Hey!" She tugged on his wrist, turning him away from the forest. "Let's go there now. It's a lovely day. Perhaps they have more books we could buy, in case of monsters," she added practically. He glanced down at her, then warmed with the hint of a smile. "I thought we had a rule about throwing books at monsters." She beamed in return, drawing him further out of the trees. "And I'm very good with rules. Remember when you told me to run?" Kiera didn't really have an image to conjure when Jessie said the words trading post, but it was smaller than she might have imagined. Just a few run-down sheds that had been converted into shops, a few more to shelter the horses, and a tavern that had likely been built several decades back. "It's charming," she ventured, stepping inside to avoid a large pile of manure. "Much better than that ghastly forest. I feel my spirits already lifting." The men glanced at the top of her head before sharing a smile. "Not sure they'll have any books," Jessie teased, glancing around the muddy street. "But if we're extremely fortunate, they might have some—" A shrill keening broke suddenly across the street, the sound of panicked hooves pounding into mud. The friends turned in unison to see a horse fighting hard against its tethers. It wore a saddle, but did not look as though it had been ridden, and a pair of blinders was fit over each eye. A man was standing before it, stout and old, with thick hands gripped desperately upon the rope. He tried speaking to the animal, but it tossed its mighty head, letting out another high scream. "Poor beast," Jessie murmured. "I wonder if she's gone lame." Eden stood in silence beside him, watching with a measured expression. But when the horse reared up again, those long legs pawing dangerously at the sky, he swept quickly across the road and took the man's place, lifting both hands to the animal's face as the rope swung free behind him. "Arsi, Arsi," he whispered gently, soothing that racking spirit and gradually easing down its head. Their foreheads pressed together as he continued those soft murmurs, running his palms along its cheeks. There was a rasping cough behind him as the old man wiped his brow in relief.
"Thank you, sir,"
he stammered, still trying to catch his breath.
"I cannot believe you would attempt such a thing without—"
He caught himself quickly, seeing his face.
"Ah, but you are Fae."
Eden flashed him a look, but continued his ministrations, running those long fingers up and down the creature's nose like a soothing balm.
"She's been like this since we left the high country," the man continued, throwing a helpless look at the friends. "I put on the blinders, but it hasn't helped."
They nodded silently, but the Fae kept his eyes on the horse. "She is frightened of the blinders," Eden replied softly.
She wishes to see the whole road. If it was me, I would take them off, allow her to walk free."
The man hesitated, then awkwardly agreed. "Yes, I'll do that now. And thank you again, truly." The Fae nodded curtly and watched as the two continued down the road. Sure enough, when they reached the stables, the man removed the blinders and stuffed them into his pocket. The horse went immediately calm, following obediently into the stall. "That was kind of you," Jesse murmured, watching by his side. "Those legs could have struck you. That's a serious risk to help a man you don't even know." Eden shook his head, keeping his eyes on the horse. "I didn't do it for him." A hint of frustration sharpened his voice. "He should not keep such animals if he doesn't know how to care for them." He opened his mouth to say something further, then closed it again with a sigh. "Let us get a room for the night, then perhaps this day can end." He left without another word, pacing toward the dilapidated tavern without sparing a single glance for the scores of people watching on either side. His friend stared after him before Jesse turned with a forced smile. "I think his spirits are lifting as well." If Kiera had hoped the tavern would help distract the Fae from the vampire lurking in the forest, she was sadly mistaken. No sooner had they secured themselves a room than he fastened himself to the window, staring with fixed attention through the glass at the distant trees. She debated trying to talk him down, then turned her attention to other things. "Jesse," she fished one of the books from his satchel, waving it between them. "Join me?" The shifter glanced over in surprise, then flashed a quick look at the Fae. His cheeks rose in colour, but Eden was in another world, those immortal eyes endlessly searching the trees. At any rate, it was nothing they hadn't already spoken of themselves. "What are you reading?" he asked, coming to join her on the bed. She lifted it high, squinting in the candlelight. "It is called A History of the Realm Thus Far." She paused, looking at the gilded lettering in the dancing flames. "I'm assuming at some point they'll be forced to write another, A History of the Realm a little farther still." Jesse smiled obligingly, but his eyes were transfixed with the letters. As she said each word, he followed along, matching them by shape, as he did not yet know the names and sounds. "This will be more rewarding than I could ever imagine." "We will go over the letters soon enough," she continued, nestling down in the bed and wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "But for now, perhaps we can just read through it a while." He nodded silently, watching as her finger traced along the page. "When the skies went dark and the sea boiled red, a lone figure stood above the waters. In one hand he carried a lantern with oil pressed from astrolabe. In the other, a watered stone that broke through the shadow like a star. His name was Erist. In the name of the gods, why does this have so many vowels?" "Eristos," Eden replied softly, turning around with a smile. "Is that in one of the books you're reading? I haven't had a chance to look through them myself yet."
Kiera smiled in relief, pleased he was looking anywhere except the window. "It figures the history of the realm would begin with an unpronounceable Fae." She tilted her head, regarding him curiously. "You know this story?"
"This story?" the Fae repeated with a smile. "You talk as though it was fiction. The tale of Aristos is not a creation, but merely a recounting of things gone past. And yes, I know it well." He abandoned the window and perched on the mattress beside them. "Aristos was a good man, impossibly brave, but sad at the same time. He was burdened with things beyond my imagination. He, too, sought out the man we aimed to find," he added. "It is said they spoke long hours about all matter of subjects. He was there for a month." "A month?" Jesse repeated in astonishment. "Must we stay that long?" Eden chuckled, raking back his long hair. "It seems so long to you," he teased. "Never fear, Shifter. I doubt the man will let us past the front door, let alone invite us to linger." Jesse leaned back with a thoughtful frown, trying to decide whether or not he considered that to be a blessing. But Kiera's fingers tightened on the book. "You're familiar with the story, but it sounds as though you know the actual man." "Only a little," Eden replied. "I met him once, though I doubt he would remember. He was an honoured guest in the halls of my father. I was only a boy at the time. In those days, many people clamoured for his attention. I was content to simply watch from afar, but he soon tired of the crowd and came to sit beside me, sat me upon his knee and told such tales." His bright eyes sparkled at the memory, lost in times gone by. "I have not thought his name in a long while." Kiera found herself smiling as well. Why did they clamour for his attention? "He was an explorer, one of the first. While others bickered and settled, he dedicated his life to the unknown, seeking out answers to questions that no one had even thought of yet." Jesse watched him with a little grin. "You had a portrait of him on your wall?" Eden laughed quietly, pushing back to his feet. "Something like that. I did keep his spoon from the feast as a souvenir. Slept with it under my pillow." The others laughed as well, unable to decide whether he was joking.
"So what happened to him?" Kiera ran her thumb along the pages, resisting the urge to skip to the end. "Is he still out there somewhere, sailing into the unknown?"
There was a slight pause. "He took his life," Eden answered briskly. "That is the end of the story." He softened a bit at the dumbstruck look on their faces. "When you have lived so long as he, it ceases to be a story worth telling. Now it is nothing but a memory, a gilded tale to make children smile."
Kiera glanced uncertainly at the book, but Eden caught her eye.
"There are worse reasons to tell stories."
She flashed a hesitant smile and continued reading while the Fae returned to the window, folding his arms and staring endlessly into the trees. There was nothing of interest to capture his attention, no evidence of anyone lurking in the trees, but there wasn't a doubt in his mind. Somewhere out there, the vampire was staring back. Chapter 5. The night in the tavern might not have been as restorative as the friends had hoped, but it filled the Fae with a new sense of resolve. When it was time to leave the next morning, he was up before anyone, packing their satchels and scouring the trading post for anything that might be of use. By the time they opened their eyes, he was standing impatiently at the foot of the bed. "On your feet," he commanded with forced cheer. "The day is wasting." This is going to be unbearable. 8 hours later, that sentiment had yet to improve. "Just saying, some of us don't have supernatural endurance." Kiera plopped down where she was standing, right in the center of the trail. "Why can we not rest? It's been almost a full day we've been walking, Eden. Uphill. Let's take a break, find something to eat." He was beside her in an instant, tugging her back to her feet.
"We will, I promise,"
he answered brightly, dusting off her shoulders before placing her back on the trail.
"As soon as we get over the next hill."
She folded her arms with a glare. He'd been promising the same thing for the last 10 miles, and none of those smiles or false cheer could hide how many times he'd glanced over his shoulder. Jesse seemed to be thinking the same thing.
"I don't think we're going to outpace him," he offered tentatively, "if that's what you're hoping. We're talking about a vampire. It's not like we can just—" "This isn't about the vampire," Eden interrupted briskly. "This is about the quest. That's all that matters, and we're making good time."
Totally believable. The vampire is the last thing on your mind.
"Maybe he can track you," Jesse murmured thoughtfully, glancing over his shoulder toward the distant trees. "He's tasted your blood. It's how many predators track their prey." Eden's jaw tightened, and Kiera flashed the shifter a quick look.
"Perhaps we should avoid using that particular word."
"I'm sure there is nothing especially complicated about it," the Fae interrupted loudly, pacing down the center of the trail. The creature has clearly been damaged in some way that left it peculiar and dumb. At this point, it's probably just hungry, like a stray dog. If he is still following us, which I highly doubt, he most likely wants to find more of my kinsman to sink his teeth into. If he is still following us, of which I am certain, he definitely just heard you. Kiera stared after him sympathetically, but Jessie was unwilling to let it rest. For the better part of a week, they had been dealing not only with the added presence of a vampire, but the Fae's increasingly volatile reactions. If he was being stalked by the creature, they must be frank. That doesn't make any sense, he inserted quietly, and it won't help to mince words about such a thing. He could have killed you, Eden, drained you dry. He didn't. He stopped. He circled in front of the Fae, breaking that ceaseless momentum. I don't know why he's following you, but I don't think it's a quest to find immortal blood. Eden pulled in a sharp breath before stepping around him. Well, you've always been exceptionally dim. The shifter rolled his eyes, falling into step alongside him. If it troubles you, we could change our course, Kiera suggested lightly, trying to cool those rising tempers. At any rate, that way we could know for sure. The Fae opened his mouth, probably to deny the idea that it troubled him, but he found himself taken with the notion at the same time. Jessie was slightly less than enthused. We were heading north, he said pointedly, lifting his finger just to illustrate the point. It is imperative that we do so with the greatest haste. Now you want to change directions. Not directions, she said quickly, just the particular route that we take. So the Fae will stop looking over his shoulder, and we can finally get some lunch. We could go through Laurelwood, Eden suggested. It's lovely this time of year. Jessie bowed his head, muttering under his breath. He would still follow you. He's following all of us, the Fae countered. No one said anything to contest this, but each of them knew it wasn't quite true. Kiera lifted her hands with a fixed smile, leaning hard into those years of bartending as she tried to navigate a peaceful solution. Well, perhaps you'd like to... Yes, let's fight. She and Jessie turned with blank stares. What? Yeah, what? I would very much like to hit something. Eden took off his bow and quiver, letting them drop onto the grass behind him. Either of you will be fine. The shifter would be better. His kind are more resilient. I would be permitted to use more strength. Kiera and Jessie shared a quick look. Fight, he ventured hesitantly. You mean spar? The Fae threw him a glance before nodding dismissively. Yes, whatever you'd like to call it. Pass. That would be so good for you, she said sweetly, giving the shifter a nudge forward. Get out a little of that aggression. I'll be watching from way over here. He threw her a look of betrayal, but by the time he turned back to Eden, the Fae was already pacing away from the trail, toward a clearing just inside the trees. He loosened his cloak and tossed it to the ground before unsheathing his knives, holding them with a speculative expression. Blades or no? No! A thick silence fell over the clearing as Eden looked at the shifter curiously, and Kiera did everything in her power not to grin. Jessie's cheeks flamed as he reluctantly joined them. I mean, no blades. We can fight without them. So it's a fight after all. On guard. No sooner had Jessie shaken off his cloak than the Fae was upon him, using very little of that elegant restraint he'd shown Kiera before. He didn't pull punches. He didn't wait for Jessie to recover, or even lift his hands. Within a matter of seconds, tiny drops of that simmering rage began spilling across the meadow, leaving echoes of profanities and trails of blood in their wake. 7 hells, Eden! Jessie staggered backward, blinking away stars as he lifted a battered hand to his jaw. I am not the thing that's troubling you. You called me prey. Back and forth they flew, tearing into each other like a pack of jackals. It was a mercy they had foregone the blades, because there was no delicacy in the way they were treating each other. The usual playfulness was gone, replaced with darker forces, the need to attack and the need to defend. It quickly reached a point where Jessie was on the verge of shifting on the spot. Kiera watched them battling beneath the shade of an oak. Her smile had long since vanished, and she was standing with a tense hand cupped over her mouth. Her eyes struggled to follow along, crippled as always by that pesky mortality, but it wasn't long before they fixed upon something else.
7 hells, she gasped.
The men broke apart immediately, following her gaze into the woods. Their blood was racing and their spirits were high. At first, they didn't understand what had startled her. Then, all at once, they saw the vampire standing amidst the trees. There was something inevitable about what happened next, something almost gravitational, like the raging current of a river, drawn ever toward the crashing falls. Once it passed a certain point, there wasn't a force on earth that could hold it back.
Eden, no!
Kiera's scream echoed in the air, but the Fae was already moving. There would be no more waiting, no more speculation or posturing. That fire had burned inside him long enough, and he still carried the faint marks of the vampire's teeth, burning on his neck like a brand. He sprinted without pause into the forest, reaching down only to grab his bow, flying on the wings of heaven straight towards the vampire. Only for once, the vampire stood his ground. Perhaps he was simply caught by surprise. Perhaps he had been burning as long as the Fae. But when Eden charged towards him, he did nothing but stand there and wait. A silver arrow cut the air between them, flying fast and true. The vampire deflected it with a flick of his hand. A second arrow followed the first. This one he caught, dropping it to the ground with the hint of a smile. The Fae let out a furious cry and abandoned the bow completely, throwing himself upon the creature with nothing but the strength of his bare hands. It was hard to describe what happened next. It was easier to describe it in the terms of other things, like the crash of a wave or the sharp burst of lightning, like the collision of two stars, one dark and one light. Such was the meeting of two such creatures. They tangled together like an ocean storm, relentless and unyielding, made different by every twist of the hand. The colours of them blurred together until at times it seemed there was only one man, lethal and beautiful and at war with himself. Then they would battle there a moment, held in suspension, then detach only long enough to throw themselves at each other again. It was a striking difference, but perhaps the thing that struck Kiera most was the parity. The two were evenly matched. That alone was shocking. She had never seen anyone match Eden before, but it was a balance always on the verge of a break. With another feral cry, Eden ripped himself free of the creature's arms and smashed him into the base of a tree, quivering the leaves on the highest branches. His fingers curled into fists around a cloak, and he pinned him violently, eyes bright as a fever, skin flushed with rage. The vampire kissed him. Fast as they had come together, a sudden space appeared between them. Not a sound was left in the clearing as Eden lowered his hands, staring in shock. "What are you doing?" The vampire stared back at him, scarcely breathing. Then he leaned in again. "No!" Eden shoved him back, hard. "No!" A different kind of tension fell over the clearing, not like the surging forces that governed it before. This one was a stillness, so cold and bare it could suck the air straight from your lungs. The vampire bared his fangs. The Fae drew his sword. That was when Kiera did something very stupid.
"Wait!"
She hurtled past the shell-shocked shifter, racing across the trampled ring of grass to the two immortals standing at its core. In a move that eclipsed her other, she threw her body in between.
"Stop! This is madness!" she gasped. "You cannot seem to kill each other, and you cannot seem to stay away. This fight is not the answer. There must be some middle path."
"You cannot be serious," the shifter cried. "You're letting him stay in our camp." Eden let out a quiet sigh, having said as much many times. "He's been following us for days, sleeping almost within sight. What is the difference, really?" Jesse stepped right up to him, standing toe to toe. "The difference is that you're inviting a vampire into our camp, a creature who recently bit 2 holes into your neck. I can still see them, just there. Shall I point them out to you?" Kiera let out a sigh of her own, casting a secret look at the vampire. He was watching the argument with the same quiet attention as when it had first started, taking neither offense nor solace in anything that was said, but focusing more on the words themselves. She had been as stunned as Jesse when the Fae made his sudden invitation. The only one who seemed more caught off balance was the vampire himself. There was a chance the offer might never have come, had he not answered correctly to a single question. "Why did you spare me?" The Fae's voice was quiet as a whisper, cool as an autumn breeze. It was the first time he said the words out loud, though he'd repeatedly asked himself the same question. It filled his every waking moment, his every searching dream. The vampire shrugged like he didn't know. He hesitated a moment, like he was weighing possibly speaking. Then his eyes flashed up with a peculiar expression. "Do you?" he mouthed. Their eyes met in the stillness, and a kind of understanding was made. An understanding that grew their fellowship from 3 to 4. "He's been travelling with us anyway," Eden was insisting, wishing very much he'd fired a few of those arrows at the shifter instead. "This way, we won't be looking over our shoulder." "No, because we'll be walking side by side." Kiera wanted very much to share that insight out loud, but between the promise of fangs and the Fae's precarious expression, she wisely chose to keep it to herself. At any rate, she felt a certain sense of responsibility for the way things had played out. Not that she'd had any idea upon suggesting a detente that Eden would take the opportunity to invite the vampire on their journey. "It's better than the alternative, and if anything goes wrong, Eden can protect us." Her eyes swept the vampire. "Maybe." With a forced determination, she squared her shoulders and took a step forward, extending her hand for an awkward introduction, but the shifter just as quickly held her back. "Can it even talk?" he demanded. Upon catching the look on Eden's face, he turned with a begrudging glare to the vampire. "Can you speak the common tongue?" The vampire stilled with a rather frightening expression, but his voice was low and calm. "Yes." If anything, that seemed to make it worse. "May I speak with you?" Jesse didn't wait for the Fae to answer. He simply stormed out of the clearing and into the trees, dragging Kiera behind him, as if he didn't care whether she was there to listen or not. Eden lingered a second longer, perhaps giving himself more time to gather his thoughts and mount some kind of defense, but there was little point. Jesse spoke first. He also spoke second. "We placed you in charge," he said abruptly, whirling upon the Fae the moment they stepped into the trees. "Of our mission, of our safety, of her safety. We placed you in charge of everything we hold most dear, and this is the decision you've made, to allow a vampire into our camp." He might as well have said monster. He might as well have said devil. There were many different words for such creatures in the common tongue. They all meant exactly the same thing. Eden lifted his hands, trying to slow things down. "I understand why you're angry." "I am not angry," Jesse interrupted with a snap, as if the word was too feeble to have any place in the discussion. "I am well beyond that. I am wondering what the hell is the matter with you. I am wondering if that fall in the forest actually broke something inside your head." The Fae stepped closer, blocking the campsite from view. "I would never let anything happen to you," he murmured, staring intently into the shifter's eyes. "You must know that by now. I give you my word, Jesse. The pair of you will be safe." "You don't know that," the shifter cried. "He doesn't know that. He is a vampire, Eden. You turn such a creature loose amongst others, and people tend to die. Will you please trust me?" "This isn't about trusting you," Jesse countered. "It's about trusting him, and I will never trust a vampire." He paused, stepping closer. "Eden, neither should you." A cold silence rang up between them. "Why are you making me say this? Why are you acting like a child? You are not risking just your life, but ours as well. You are risking everything we are trying to accomplish." In spite of his efforts, Eden's eyes strayed to Kiera. It was all echoes of what she had said before. There was a crack in the armor, the smallest flicker of doubt. "He isn't like that," he said softly. "He is a vampire. He is a vampire who stopped himself from drinking my blood." Eden interrupted with sudden passion. "That is impossible, Jesse. Such a thing has never happened before. Vampires and fey blood. Do you not know they cannot resist it? Have you not heard the stories?" He shook his head. "You cannot say he is like the rest of them." "That's right. He stopped himself from killing you," Jesse exclaimed, applauding with ice in his veins. "I remember it now. After he attacked you, pinned you to the ground, ripped open your neck, and was just seconds from taking your life, he managed to pause." He shook his head slowly. "I'm glad you take some inexplicable comfort in that, Eden, but I do not see it the same way." The Fae shot a quick glance over his shoulder. "Lower your voice." "Why?" Jesse tilted his head dangerously. "Because the vampire might hear me, and a vampire doesn't argue a point, does it? A vampire will just rip your bloody arms off." The silence that fell between them was hard as any that had come before. Never had they found themselves at such an impasse. No way across, not a hint of compromise. In the end, they were left with nothing but raw emotion, armed with no other strategy but to speak from the heart. Eden stood there a moment. Then he reached for the shifter's arm. "I need you to trust me," he said again softly. "Not that I can control the validity of a vampire," he added quickly, at the look on the shifter's face, "but that I will stop any of those tempers from falling onto you. I need you to trust me, because I need to see this through." Even as he said the words, the friends realized it was true, same as the vampire listening through the trees. For whatever the reason, for whatever the cost, something had set the two men on a collision course, a kind of cosmic trajectory that was worthy of the fates. The Fae took a step closer, bridging the distance between them. "You told me once the three of us found each other for a reason," he murmured, staring deep into the shifter's eyes. "Perhaps he found us in the same way." There was a lingering pause, then Jesse extracted his arm. "I never told you that. I shared that with Kiera." Another pause. "I was eavesdropping. For the love of Jesse, I need you to give this a chance." The shifter stood there a moment longer, a bitter rage of emotions warring in his eyes. Then he paced away with sudden exasperation, cursing under his breath. "I'll see you in the morning," he called, heading back to camp. "I'll be the one lying in pieces around the fire, when it turns out you're wrong." Eden stared after him, eyes lingering on that dark hair. "That is a price I could live with." Kiera flashed him a hard look. "If you make jokes, I'll stab you myself." The vampire hadn't moved more than an inch since they'd left him in the clearing. His face was clear of emotion, but Kiera got the feeling he'd been listening to every word. Jessie stormed past without sparing him a look. "What should I call it?" Eden threw him a wary look, but asked the obligatory question. "What is your name, vampire?" There was a pause. "Evander." The Fae stared at him a moment before gesturing on either side. "This is Kiera and Jessie. We're heading to the High Country. Do you know it?" There was a nod. "Good. Then you can lead the way." The Fae began walking to the tent without a backward glance, assumedly to scream to death in his pillow. But the vampire called out softly a moment before he could touch the door. "Your name is Eden." The Fae hesitated, then turned. There was no reason to answer. The vampire had heard it screamed with a creative assortment of profanities for the better part of an hour, but he asked it all the same. Eden parted his lips to answer, then merely nodded. "Do you have everything you need?" The vampire nodded in return. "Good night, then." "Good night." They parted ways without another word. The three friends shared the tent together while the vampire settled down beneath the stars. The fire simmered down to ashes as the moon passed slowly across the sky. Oddly enough, it was the best sleep the Fae had gotten in a long while. Chapter 6. When Kiera opened her eyes the next morning, the tent was empty. She sat up blearily, her eyes drifting around the rumpled blankets. Usually, there was at least one person still nestled beside her. It was a tight fit, smaller than anything she was used to, but she'd grown surprisingly attached to it. The heat of three bodies warmed the little space better than she could have imagined, and there was something undeniably soothing about the sound of quiet breathing lulling one to sleep. She smiled vaguely at the thought. Then she remembered their new houseguest. What if they've been eaten? Without fully pausing to consider the concept of "you'll be next," she looped a cloak around her neck, half strangling herself in the process, then stumbled frantically toward the door. The canvas flew open as she burst into the campsite, gasping for breath and caught in her own clothes. "Guys, where?" Three men stared back at her. One was trying hard not to smile. "Oh, good morning." She straightened up with as much dignity as possible, pushing back her hair and tugging discreetly at the cord wrapped around her neck. "How did everyone sleep?" Ironically enough, there was no reason for any of the friends to keep watch that night, not with a vampire in the camp. By his very nature, nothing would be foolish enough to approach. "Not sure what that says about our decision-making process." That being said, it was hard to say whether anything was wrong. If she hadn't known any better, she might have guessed it was just a regular morning. The kettle was bubbling, the flames were crackling, and the canteens for the day's hike had already been filled. The friends were gathered around the same as always, despite their visitor from the undead. But there was a tension in the little clearing that hadn't been there since the first days of their journey, when they were strangers to each other, and she still had the smell of dragon smoke in her hair. All of them glanced up when she appeared, but none of them answered the question. She swiftly reconsidered it herself. Was I the only one sleeping? Were we not supposed to sleep? Her eyes flickered to Evander. Does a vampire sleep? It was a question that would long continue to plague her, but she wasn't going to get the answer that morning, nor would she allow herself to indulge in some kind of silent contemplation like the others, wondering if they'd made the right choice. The invitation had been extended, and the man was sitting across the fire. It was settled. Time to show a little old-fashioned hospitality. She paced forward and poked around the cauldron, wishing it was anything more appetizing than unsweetened porridge. Nevertheless, she reached for a bowl, flashing a polite smile. "Evander, can I get you some?" She caught herself quickly, regretting the moment she'd gotten out of bed. "Some what? Some breakfast? One of us, perhaps?"
Maybe the shifter, because he cursed you at the top of his lungs. Maybe the Fae, since you've clearly fallen under his ridiculous spell. Maybe me, just on principle." The vampire's eyes twinkled, though his face was clear. "I'm not hungry, but thank you," he added swiftly, flashing a look at Eden. Although he'd been the one to extend the invitation, the Fae was the only person who didn't seem particularly preoccupied with the addition of a vampire. He was doing the same thing he did every morning during breakfast. He was checking his arrows to see if any were in need of repair. "Of course," Kiera murmured. "My mistake." She filled her bowl quickly and settled next to Jessie on the nearest log. Unlike the Fae, who'd actually gotten a full night's sleep for the first time in weeks, the shifter was rigid as a statue. He gave a curt nod of acknowledgement when she sat beside him, but never took his eyes away from the vampire, as if at any moment their fragile truce might reach an end. I wonder what would happen if it did. She followed his gaze and considered the vampire cautiously, remembering the way he tackled the Fae right out of the sky. There was nothing overtly dangerous about him. If anything, it was hard to get past the haunting beauty. The snippets of stories and tavern gossip hadn't done him justice. Unlike the effortless allure of the shifter or the starlit wonder of the Fae, it was as though the vampire had been designed specifically to entrance, carved to perfection, with features that were both masculine yet delicate, a body that was both lithe yet strong. His face had an almost unnerving symmetry, framed with hair of pure obsidian falling in gentle waves to his chin, and while his skin was pale, his eyes were dark as the night, black holes by themselves, but they seemed to reflect every flicker of light around them, like the man himself was merely a lens. Right now, all that unnerving attention was focused upon the Fae. It was almost strange to sit in proximity, as if the others were abruptly superfluous and the two men were in a world all to themselves. The intensity was matched only by the discretion, but she was sure that Eden noticed. The man noticed everything. He was not blind to something like this. Evander kissed him, she remembered in sudden shock. In light of the larger existential issues they'd been grappling with, it had nearly passed from memory. He actually kissed him. I almost forgot. The Fae didn't forget. He was thinking on it that very moment. His eyes flickered up as the others continued their awkward breakfast, resting upon the vampire with the same question as before. The only solace he seemed to have was that he wasn't the only one asking questions. The vampire seemed to be asking a great many of them himself. "Did you just come from the fairgrounds?" he asked suddenly, breaking that claustrophobic silence. "I heard screams from the forest. The beast I saw you kill. Were there more like it?" He spoke to the entire group, but his eyes never left Eden. That being said, whether he was consciously aware of it or not, the Fae was having trouble meeting his gaze. "There were many more," Eden answered softly, never glancing up from his arrows. "The kinds of creatures I had not seen for a long while." The vampire absorbed this silently, but Jessie leaned abruptly forward. "Were you heading to the festival?" he asked pointedly, letting the implication hang in the air between them. A vampire lurking in the woods outside a large gathering of people could really only mean one thing. "It's a shame you weren't there for the fight. We could have met a lot sooner." Kiera sucked in a sharp breath, digging her elbow into the side of his ribs, while Eden shot a pained look towards the heavens. By the diplomatic arrangement they'd reached before, vampires weren't exactly known for keeping their tempers. It took very little to set them off, and there was still plenty of ways this one could massacre them before the end of breakfast. "Perhaps he'll add us to the porridge, give it a little colour." Evander regarded him for a long moment. "Is that where the three of you met?" he asked softly, glancing between them. It was an unlikely group of companions. He must have been wondering for a long time. Kiera leaned forward swiftly. "Actually, we've been travelling together a while. No need for that, darling." Jessie pulled her back with a tight smile, actually switching places with her on the log,
so he was sitting in between. No need to answer any of his questions, if he has no intention of answering any of ours. Why were you at the festival, vampire? A cold silence fell over the clearing. For a split second, none of them knew how to break it. The vampire had frozen with an unfathomable expression. Jesse was refusing to lower his gaze, and Kiera was clutching her bowl of porridge like some kind of life raft, feeling every frantic heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, in a move that was oddly parallel to the one that happened the night before, Eden rose to his feet, took Jesse by the arm, and yanked him off the bench with a tight smile. "May I speak with you?" He left without a backward glance, dragging the shifter into the trees. Kiera froze on the bench, staring at the patch of ferns where they had vanished. She lingered there for a second, then her eyes drifted back to the frozen vampire, sitting just a few steps away. I should probably... She raced after them a second later, doing everything in her power not to run. They may have departed quickly, but they hadn't gone far. Only a few seconds into the forest, she saw them standing together beneath a group of trees, having yet to speak. It was no longer a discussion of manners or logistics. Jesse seemed to be actually trying to incense the creature, though why he would attempt such a thing was a complete bewilderment. Eden held back the first things he wished to say, then asked a simple question. "What is your goal?" "A vampire has no control," Jesse announced, as if he'd merely been waiting to be asked the question. "They are nightmares that kill, then vanish into the dark. This is a well-known fact, Eden, yet somehow you have forgotten it. So I am going to prove it to you." There was a beat of silence. "By getting yourself killed?" The shifter paled a bit, but held his ground. "Not killed, I hope. Probably maimed." He shivered in spite of himself, but hurried them forward. "The point is, the creature will attack me, and in doing so, reveal itself to you. You will then kill it, as you should have done from the start, thus saving Kiera's life from the inevitable disaster that would end it." He nodded with satisfaction. "The two of you may then mourn me." Eden stared in utter disbelief. "I cannot believe we are having this conversation. You invited the conversation. You invited the conversation to go camping with us. Lower your bloody..." Eden threw a quick glance over his shoulder before turning back with something that might almost have been a smile. Exasperated as he was by the shifter's tactic, it seemed very much like the kind of thing he might have suggested himself. "And what if you offend me?" he demanded, "by forcing the cold-blooded murder of someone I have invited as a guest?" Jesse lifted his shoulders with a shrug. "You would be angry for a while and then get over it." There was a pause. "You have come to know me too well," Eden muttered, raking back his hair. "It will make things difficult moving forward." The shifter smirked and took a step back toward the camp, but he caught him by the arm. "That is not the solution. We discussed it last night, and my pledge to both you and Kiera has not changed. Will you make me a promise in return? Will you at least be polite?" Jesse lifted a hand to his heart. "I swear on our friendship." That doesn't bode well. He swept away a second later, leaving the Fae behind him and breezing straight past Kiera, pausing only to press a gallant kiss to her cheek. The others stood there in silence, unable to move. "I shouldn't have made porridge," Eden finally muttered, staring after him. "Everyone hates porridge. It puts the whole camp in a foul mood." "Or it might be the vampire." "Come on." She waved him quickly forward, nervous to let the others alone. "He may be infuriating, but he's not suicidal, which is more than I can say for you." The Fae said nothing to contest this. He merely followed swiftly behind her as they made their way back to camp. The shifter had just gotten there himself, flashing a polite smile. "Where were we?" he asked cheerfully, taking a seat. We were speaking of the festival." Eden and Kiera froze dead still behind him, but the vampire's lips curved with the ghost of a smile,
as if that particular lack of sanity was something he could admire. "Why were you there?" Jessie repeated. Evander stared back without a hint of apology or shame, just an expressionless gaze that was enough to give the rest of them nightmares. For a split second, Kiera thought that he wasn't going to answer. For a split second, she was quite sure he was going to murder them instead. Then he turned his eyes to the fire, speaking in that low, musical voice. "It was the noise. These woods are quiet. I welcomed the noise." Utter shock. Utter silence. Even Jessie could think of nothing to say. After a few seconds, the little camp settled back the way it had been before. The fire was dusted, and the dishes were cleaned over its ashes. The tent was capsized and tightly folded before being shoved into Eden's pack. No one said a single word to each other the entire time, and yet the silence wasn't the same as it had been before. There was space in it now. There was room to grow. "So, you are heading to the high country?" Evander began curiously, watching as they finished the last of the tasks. "A shifter, a girl, and a fae." He didn't exactly ask a question, but one was there all the same. The three friends looked at each other, realizing there were other things they should have discussed. It wasn't exactly a secret what they were doing, but it was dangerous. It was urgent, and it was the kind of thing that might cause widespread panic if word got out. "But we've asked him to come with us," Kiera thought, trying to communicate as much to the others as they locked eyes. "We cannot do that without letting him know the risk." There was a chance they understood, because Eden finally met the vampire's gaze. "A 3-headed dragon destroyed Kiera's village, a creature that predates anything I have experienced with myself. We are traveling north to seek out answers. Where it resides, how it might be killed. Once we know those things, we can return and come up with some kind of plan." It took a lot to rattle a vampire, but that caught him by surprise. He stared for a moment, possibly replaying the words 3-headed dragon, before his brow creased with a frown. "You mean to tell the fae?" Even creatures as wild and nomadic as vampires knew how the kingdom of immortals looked out for the rest of the world. They had felt the sting of their punishment often enough. "It sounds like a delusion. How would they believe it without seeing proof themselves?" There was something oddly pragmatic about him, a quality that could easily turn both ways when it came equipped with fangs. But he'd only said that it sounded like a delusion, not that it actually was. It was a distinction that Kiera appreciated very much. "They will believe it if I tell them," Eden replied. No one questioned this. Such was the word of a fae. "One way or another, we have to try," Kiera continued quietly, trying to interpret the look on the vampire's face. "The creature was bigger than anything I've seen before, 10 times the size of anything we fought at Karnassus. It swept out of the clouds and destroyed my home with a single breath. It wasn't hunting. It was done for sport, and it didn't leave anyone alive." Evander took a second to absorb this, studying the details of her face. "And you mean to find these creatures?" he clarified abruptly. "You are actively seeking them out." His eyes flickered with something close to amusement to Eden. "Just the 3 of you?" The fae didn't answer. His attention was back on his bow. "You probably don't want to come with us," Jessie remarked innocently. "There is no shame in it. It's said that a vampire will never start a fight it can't win." A rather terrifying prospect, considering the creature had attacked them. There was also a strain placed upon the word vampire that was impossible to ignore. But for once, Evander wasn't paying attention. His eyes strayed across the fire to where the fae was calmly rethreading his bow. "That's true," he murmured, "but I seem to be doing a lot of that lately." He considered a second longer, then made up his mind. "I shall come." In a strange turn of events, Kiera found herself abruptly thrilled by the words. Jessie was equally dismayed.
though he kept his reluctant promise and said nothing further. Eden never looked up from his bow, but his lips curved with the faintest trace of a smile. "The fastest route is not the mountain trail you've been taking, but to cut through the flatlands," the vampire continued. "The storms have washed away too many trails for mortal feet." He paced forward a second later, dropping a pair of arrows into the Fae's hand. The others stared a moment in confusion, not understanding where he'd possibly gotten them. Then, all at once, it clicked. They were the same ones that he'd shot at the vampire only hours before. Jessie's eyes flashed between them as Kiera lifted a slow hand to her mouth. She didn't know whether to laugh or scream, but she had a feeling she'd be wondering that a lot in the days to come. "You might be needing these." Eden stared at them a moment before placing them in with the rest. "How clumsy of me. They must have slipped right out of my hands." Chapter 7. The vampire was right about the storms. No sooner had they left the clearing than the trail they'd been considering disappeared beneath their feet, washed away by the heavy rains. They took his advice and left the forest behind, heading down the slopes toward the flattened valley below. It wasn't the easiest fellowship, but given the combustible elements they were mixing, it wasn't the hardest one either. This was mostly because they kept to their places. Eden was ahead, scouting out the trail. Kiera followed just behind, nestled between him and Jessie, while the vampire brought up the rear, his sharp eyes seeing as far as anyone else on the path. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it wasn't forced. Just a comment on the weather or a warning about something on the trail. When it was time to stop for lunch, Evander didn't say anything. He merely pointed in a specific direction, calling their attention to a herd of deer. It was a far cry from their usual frivolity. None of Eden's musicals, Kiera's interrogations, and Jessie's occasional tendency to transform into a wolf. But, in a way, the quiet was nice. It gave them time to collect their thoughts, and every single one of them was thinking the same thing. Why is Evander here? The obvious answer was the Fae. Ever since first glimpsing Eden in the forest, fighting off some hellish monster like a vengeful angel come to earth, the vampire had been unable to tear his eyes away from him. He was clearly there for the Fae, except there was nothing obvious about it. A vampire and a Fae were not meant to share company. It went beyond preference and history to a fundamental clashing of nature. Creature of darkness and creature of light. A vampire was destruction incarnate, standing in direct opposition to that delicate balance the Fae had sworn to protect, and there wasn't a thing in creation a vampire craved more than the taste of eternal blood. That was the reality. That was the world in which they lived. Someone forgot to tell them. Kiera twisted her head for the 5th time that morning, casting a secret look between the two immortals. While she could see nothing but the Fae's shimmering hair as he walked in front of her, the vampire's eyes were locked upon him as always, guiding a beacon as he made his way silently over the grass. It was ceaseless. To be honest, she wasn't sure he was entirely aware of it himself. "You'll hurt your neck if you keep doing that," Jessie chided softly, walking up beside her. He too had been tracking the movements of the vampire and the Fae, but after the better part of the day, with nothing to show for it, he was giving up. "And you're not as discreet as you think." She ignored this, fancying herself the perfect spy. "Why do you think—" He pressed a casual finger over her lips, draping an arm around her shoulders. "I think everyone in this forest can hear better than you." He flashed a teasing smile, giving her a little squeeze. "And I don't know," he added quietly. "I don't know what to think." "Hang on a moment," Eden called, stopping suddenly on the trail. His head tilted to the side as his eyes drifted out of focus. "Do you hear that?" "No."
At first, Kiera thought he was merely teasing her, another of his public admonishments, reminding her to keep those pesky questions to herself. But he looked away from them a moment later, turning his gaze toward the distant valley. A little smile crept over him, twinkling in his eyes.
"It sounds like singing."
In a flash, he changed course, leading them not down the rocky trail, but toward a softer, grassy path that veered toward a distant road. It was the kind of place they would usually avoid, but the friends had often found themselves hostage to such whims. At any rate, they didn't mind. It was only the vampire who stared after them in surprise, wondering why they would waste the time. The trail was easy, and it wasn't long before they reached the valley floor, winding with the rest of the slow-moving travelers, until they came upon the music that had caught the Fae's ear. It was a trio of bards, travelling minstrels. One was playing a flute, and another a violin, while the third was singing in a voice as clear as a stream on a hot summer's day. Eden paused with a smile to listen, pulling in a deep breath.
"Do you like music?" he asked.
Evander glanced up in surprise, realizing the question was directed at him. His eyes swept over the bards, like he didn't quite see the purpose of them, but he nodded in reply. "Yes, some." The Fae smiled again, tapping out the rhythm upon his leg.
"Then there is hope for you, vampire."
The others had no idea what to make of this, and the vampire didn't linger long. As soon as the song was finished, he tossed a coin into the jar and continued walking into the endless expanse. His friends were quick to follow after him, but the vampire stayed where he was, staring in silence. His lips were slightly parted, revealing just the tip of those deadly fangs, and there was a faint tension around the corners of his eyes, like a person trying to stare too long into the sun. It wasn't until Eden called again that he startled out of his trance.
"Are you coming?"
He drew in a quick breath, then headed after them, the sound of music still ringing in his ears. The friends continued walking for the rest of the day, and well after nightfall, stopping to rest only after they'd found an area of higher ground where they could take some shelter within the trees. There were no explosive arguments, no subtle jabs, or casual homicides. They moved together as a unit, quiet perhaps, but effective, with the deceptive quality of people who had been travelling together for a long time. When they finally settled down for bed, there wasn't room enough for the tent, so they simply laid out under the stars. The vampire was on one side of the fire, the friends were on the other. It was casually done, but at no point did the two groups collide. Kiera wrapped her blanket around her, staring with that signature discretion across the crackling flames. They might have settled, but the vampire gave no indication he was going to fall asleep. He merely stretched out his legs and stared toward the horizon, those bright eyes drifting back every so often to rest upon the Fae. They seemed more natural in the night-time, perhaps because everything around them was dark as well, but there was no mistaking that particular expression, any more than he could hide the look of abstract longing that flashed across his face. When Kiera opened her eyes in the morning, he was still staring. "Good morning," she said quietly, hitching onto her arms. He flashed her a quick look, then returned his gaze to the sleeping Fae, remembering to echo the greeting a second too late. "Yes, good morning." He might have continued staring forever, but the Fae suddenly opened his eyes. In the space of a heartbeat, he turned the opposite direction, gazing toward the distant hills. "Subtle."
"7 hells, it's cold,"
Eden murmured, tightening his cloak before pushing gracefully to his feet. "I'm going to relight the fire." He raised his voice slightly.
"How did everyone sleep?"
Also subtle. Kiera waited until he'd paced out of the campsite, collecting kindling and pieces of brush, before turning to the vampire with a secret smile. "That's rather unsettling, you know." It was like she hadn't even spoken. It was like she wasn't even there. "He looks like an angel." Evander spoke without thinking, then bowed his head with the closest thing a vampire could come to a blush. "He looks like how I'd imagine an angel." Jesse awoke beside them, tensing involuntarily as he followed the vampire's gaze. "Spend a lot of time imagining angels?" he asked sharply, uneasy with the intensity of that ceaseless stare. What would a vampire know about heaven? "No more or less than anyone else." The trio lifted their heads as Eden paced back into the clearing, dropping what he'd gathered onto the flames. He gave the vampire a wide berth, but flashed a quick smile as he sat down. "Why are we speaking of this?" Evander pushed to his feet abruptly. "Absolutely no reason whatsoever." He flashed a chilling look at the others. "I'm off to find breakfast." He paused halfway out of the camp. "Will you be here when I return?" Eden's lips quirked with the faintest smile. "We may try to make a run for it, but I doubt we would get far." The vampire stared a moment, then vanished into the trees. "Why do you indulge him?" Jesse demanded. The Fae glanced over in surprise. "I don't." "Why is he here?" the shifter clarified sharply. "We were doing just fine on our own. We are traveling through a world designed to kill us, seeking out monsters who would love nothing more than to do the same. You would begrudge the help of a vampire?" Jesse stared at him evenly. "That's not why he's here." The Fae pushed back to his feet a second later, eyes flashing as he smoothed needlessly at his cloak. "I'm going to scout the path. Try not to make any dangerous assumptions while I'm gone." He vanished a second later, in the opposite direction as the vampire. Kiera waited until he was gone, then turned to Jesse with a scowl. "Why are you so hard on him?" His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Why am I hard on him?" he repeated. "The man is risking our safety just to satisfy some personal curiosity. A dangerous whim. You think I'm being hard on him?" She bit the inside of her cheek. "Evander was following us anyway." "So Eden should have killed him," Jesse interrupted flatly. "I love how we're all pretending to forget, but that's what you do with vampires. You kill them before they can kill you." He lifted a hand before she could reply. "Have you never seen one before?" he asked quietly. "Have you never seen the things that they can do? My pack came upon a village once that had been plagued with a vampire. And yes, those are the kinds of words they use. It was like walking into a never-ending funeral. Again and again the creature came back, until there was no one left in the entire village to bury the rest." She shivered in spite of herself, thinking of the vampire's enigmatic stare. "Evander isn't like that," she said quietly. "You've seen him." "I've seen his obsession," Jesse clarified. "And heaven help us when that obsession comes to its inevitable end. I'm not sure Eden could stop him, and Eden is the strongest man I know." She shook her head helplessly, staring at the empty blanket where Evander had sat. "But surely every vampire is different," she insisted. "But the laws that govern them are the same," the shifter countered. "A vampire wants blood. That is the only thing that drives them. And we are allowing him to travel each day and sleep each night beside a fae. It is a miracle that nothing has happened already. Oh wait, it already has." She shivered again, remembering the way the ground shook when Eden was flung out of the sky. She'd half thought he was dead already. The impact alone would have been enough. When the vampire sank its teeth into his neck, it had seemed a particular cruelty. They loved him, and they would have to watch. "See?" Jesse nudged her with a little smile. "Even now he has us fighting. A real-life monster, through and through." She chuckled in spite of herself, tucking back her hair. It was a strange habit they'd developed, balancing the darkness that overwhelmed them with shining points of light. "You have us fighting," she argued. Our resident vampire has done nothing but point you in the direction of that unfortunate deer." The shifter lifted his eyes in the direction where he'd vanished, seeing nothing but endless plains of barren land. "What do you suppose he's eating?" She shrugged, folding up her blanket. "Puppies, unicorns, kittens and bunnies with their fluffy little tails." He turned back with a grin, watching her work. "I suppose you think that's rather funny." She stopped at once, twisting around to face him. "Jessie, it is funny. And for the record, I make a magnificent spy." He smiled then, unable to stop himself. "You know, it's a real shame about this dragon business." He tilted his head, looking her up and down. "I've wished many times that we'd met under different circumstances." She paused, caught off guard. "You don't like the monsters and broken limbs?" she asked incredulously. "You don't like the bitter cold at night or the fact that we're never truly alone?" He scooted closer, easing the blanket from her hands. "We're alone now." Her cheeks flamed, and she cast a hasty glance toward the horizon. "For like a minute, Jessie. They could be back at any moment." He nodded distractedly, staring at her lips. "We'll have to make the most of it then." The Fae returned only a short while later, cursing loudly when he saw the two entangled and threatened to gouge out his own eyes. When the vampire returned a few minutes later, glowing with the rush of fresh blood, he seemed genuinely pleased that they hadn't left without him. He also seemed a little overwhelmed. Perhaps it was the first time he'd gotten a little distance, making it all the more real when he came back. Perhaps it was merely the blood, but his eyes widened as they fell upon each new thing, fastening onto every insignificant detail with the quiet wonder of one who'd never seen them before. The sound of the kettle, the smell of biscuits charred by the smoke. He watched them go about their morning tasks with wild attention, before finally turning to the Fae. "Should I do something?" Eden startled in surprise, then went suddenly still. "What?" There was a little pause, then the vampire gestured around. "It seems everyone has a task. Shall I perform some service as well?" If anyone else had asked, the Fae would have made some joke. As it stood, Kiera expected him politely to refuse and turn the vampire away, but he glanced around the campfire instead. "Tend to the fire." The vampire froze a split second, as if waiting for him to retract it. Then he nodded curtly and vanished into the sunlit haze, gathering larger pieces of wood from the distant trees. When he returned only a few minutes later, Kiera stepped forward, determined to be as friendly as well. "Start with something easy. Most everyone has fond memories of home." "So, I'm sure you've been travelling a long while," she began conversationally. "But where is it that you're from, Evander? Is it near the place where we—" Two voices answered in swift unison. "Don't even think about it. What the hell is wrong with you?" Evander glanced between them in surprise, as Kiera folded her arms with a scowl. "Seriously?" she demanded. "I'm just trying to be—" Do not let her fool you," Eden warned, unable to suppress an exasperated grin. "And do not allow yourself to be sucked into her game. The girl is insatiable with questions. Once it starts—" He trailed off ominously, and Evander warmed with the beginning of a smile. "Insatiable," he repeated with amusement, turning his eyes to the barmaid. "I do not wish to disappoint you, but my people are wanderers. We do not have a homeland, as you might call it." "Really?" She took a step closer, engaged in spite of herself. "But do they never travel in groups? Have they never attempted any kind of settlement? If they've been travelling for so many years, how would they even—" He laughed softly, raking back his hair. "Insatiable," he murmured again. "I see what you mean." In hindsight, it was fully possible that he didn't realize the effect that single moment had on the others. the moment when they heard a vampire laugh for the first time. Jessie was simply wary. Kiera attributed it to herself. But Eden was staring in silent astonishment, as if in all his own years of travelling he had never heard anything quite like it before. "But no, I know of no vampires who travel together," Evander continued obliviously, trying to piece through her breathless onslaught. "And no, there has never been any kind of settlement." She nodded with a shy smile. Eden was still staring openly behind her. The shifter glanced between them before slinging his satchel across his back. "Of course there hasn't," he said gruffly. "How could there be?" The spell shattered as the others glanced at him in surprise. Eden was immediately wary, but Kiera was merely confused, pressing forward when she should have kept silent. "What does that mean? Why not?" Jessie flashed the vampire a quick look. "His kind bring only death to others. If they ever stopped wandering, if they ever tried to build themselves a home, it wouldn't be long before everyone around them ended up dead."